The first time I saw the cabin, it was nearly swallowed by the trees. The air was crisp with the scent of pine and wet earth, the kind of smell that clings to your clothes and hair after a long walk in the forest. The path leading to it was little more than a trail, marked by old, faded blazes on the trunks of massive trees, and I had followed it for what felt like hours, trudging over roots and fallen branches, my boots sinking slightly into the damp soil. The cabin itself was small and weathered, its wood dark and rough, streaked with the gray of age and moss. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, and a single narrow chimney rose crookedly from the side, and used, it seemed, for a long time. I had rented it online on a whim, needing a weekend away from everything. The city noise, the endless demands, the sense that life was always moving faster than I could keep up with. The listing had promised isolation, quiet, and a true escape. I hadn't expected it to feel so remote, so utterly alone. I arrived as the sun was dipping behind the hills, painting the sky in pale orange and violet. My first task was the small stack of firewood at the side of the cabin, which I checked carefully, making sure there were enough logs to last the night. The cabin was equipped with a small wood stove, its iron door rusty but intact. The interior smelled faintly of dust and damp, the floors uneven and creaking under my weight. A few thin rugs lay on the wooden planks, fraying at the edges, and the furniture was simple. 2 chairs, a small table, a bed with a thin mattress and a coarse blanket. A single window faced the forest, offering a view that was more unsettling than calming once the sun set. Shadows began to grow long and dark across the floor, reaching like fingers into the corners. I unpacked my things slowly, deliberately. I didn't want to rush this moment, didn't want to feel careless. I stacked the firewood neatly beside the stove, lined my backpack against the wall, and took a long, steadying breath. Outside, the wind rustled the branches, and the quiet was absolute except for that and the occasional distant sound of birds settling down for the night. As the light faded entirely, the forest around the cabin shifted. It wasn't a matter of ghosts or spirits. It was just how the trees looked when you could no longer see the colors, when everything became shapes and movement in black and gray. The world felt thinner somehow, closer, pressing against the cabin walls. I lit the stove, the small fire catching after a few tries, filling the room with the faint scent of smoke and resin. Flames flickered, casting shadows across the walls, and I noticed how even in this small space, the darkness seemed heavier beyond the reach of the light. I moved around, checking each corner, feeling the rough wood under my fingertips, tracing the edges of the window frames. Everything was solid, real, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the isolation had weight, like the forest outside was watching and waiting, patient and silent. Night deepened. I ate a simple meal I had brought, using the small kitchen area in the cabin. A stove, a sink, a countertop the width of my arm. Each noise outside the cabin, a branch snapping, leaves rustling, sounded far too loud. The sound of a small animal scuttling through the undergrowth made me tense, my heart jumping, and I realized I had left the window slightly open. I closed it, double-checking the latch, feeling a chill creep through my shirt despite the warmth of the fire. The cabin suddenly felt smaller, closer, and every little noise seemed to echo, amplified by the quiet. Hours passed slowly. I sat in one of the chairs, staring at the flickering fire, listening. The wind shifted, the trees groaning under it. Somewhere far away, I could hear water running, a stream, or maybe the drainage from some higher ground. I tried to think of other things, work, life, the city, but the stillness of the forest kept creeping back into my mind. Every crack of the wood, every small creak, made my body tense. At some point, sleep became impossible. I moved to the bed, wrapping myself in the thin blanket, the mattress uneven beneath me, and tried to close my eyes. But the sounds didn't stop. Around midnight, something shifted. The wind had picked up outside, rattling the window panes, shaking the cabin ever so slightly. It was then that I heard the first distinct sound that didn't belong. A slow, deliberate scraping, like someone dragging something across the ground. My body froze. The sound didn't come from the trees, not exactly, not from the natural noises of the forest. It was closer, just beyond the wall, and it repeated, slow, deliberate. My mind raced, imagining every possible explanation. A branch falling? An animal? But the pattern was too deliberate, too measured. My stomach sank. I forced myself to stand, gripping the edge of the table. My breath came faster, my heart beat loud in my ears. I moved quietly to the door, careful not to make any sound, and pressed my ear against the wood. Silence. Only the wind. And then, almost immediately, the scraping returned closer around the side of the cabin. I could hear the subtle crunch of dirt and leaves. Whoever, or whatever, was out there was moving deliberately around the cabin, and I realized with a cold certainty that I was completely alone, with no immediate help for miles. Panic began to claw at me. I considered calling someone, but my phone had no signal. I considered leaving, but the forest in the dark was a maze, and I didn't know the trail well. Every sound outside felt magnified. The scraping, the occasional thump, the rustle of heavy boots or claws through leaves. I realized the fire wouldn't keep me safe, the cabin itself offering no real protection except for the walls. My mind spun through the possibilities, each one worse than the last. I spent the next hour in a heightened state of awareness, moving quietly from window to window, trying to track the movements outside. The sounds came and went, sometimes stopping entirely, only to begin again elsewhere. I kept the fire going, keeping the light low, trying not to reveal myself, trying not to provoke whatever it was. Sleep was impossible, and the minutes stretched like hours. I stayed awake, listening, waiting. Eventually, the scraping and movement stopped entirely. The night grew quieter, the wind dying down, the forest settling again. I didn't move, didn't breathe, until I was sure it was over. When the first light of dawn crept through the trees, I moved cautiously to the window. The forest was empty. There were tracks, barely visible, leading away from the cabin. Deep, heavy footprints, dragging in places, cutting across the trail and disappearing into the trees. My stomach churned at the sight, and I realized how close I had come to something dangerous. I didn't stay another night. I packed quickly, careful not to leave anything behind, and followed the trail back, every step slow and deliberate. I kept glancing back, half expecting to see movement, to hear the scraping again. But the forest remained still. By the time I reached the road and my car, I felt a strange mixture of relief and lingering fear, the memory of the night etched into my mind in vivid, raw detail. Later, I researched the area. I found nothing unusual in the records. No reports of intruders or accidents. It seemed impossible, but I had the footprints as proof, the memory of the deliberate scraping and movement circling the cabin, the realization that someone or something had been very close. I never returned to that cabin, and I chose my trips to the wilderness differently afterward. I stick to areas that are populated, with clear trails and other people around. The experience stayed with me for years, a constant reminder that isolation has a weight, and that the forest, while beautiful and serene, can also hide danger in the simplest, most ordinary ways. I learned to respect it, to never take solitude for granted, and to prepare for every possibility when I ventured into the wild. I carry that lesson with me always. And sometimes, when I hear the faintest sound of scraping under fallen leaves or branches, my pulse quickens, my mind drifts back to that night, and I remember just how close reality can come to terror. I had been looking forward to this weekend for weeks, the quiet promise of a cabin deep in the woods, away from everything. I packed my old, reliable backpack carefully, making sure I had enough food, water, and supplies for 3 days. A sleeping bag, a small first aid kit, a flashlight, extra batteries, and a little stove filled my bag. I had double-checked my map and marked the cabin's location, which was deep in a forested area about 2 hours from the nearest town. I had told no one where I was going, mostly because I wanted to be alone, to escape the endless buzz of work, people, and noise. The drive itself was calm at first. The road started paved, then narrowed into a winding gravel path, twisting through thick pine trees and sharp hills. The air grew cooler as I climbed higher. Eventually, the gravel disappeared entirely, leaving only a faint dirt trail lined with dense trees, so tight they almost blocked out the sunlight. I parked the car at the edge of a clearing near the trailhead. From there, the cabin was still about a 2-hour hike. My backpack felt heavy, but it was the kind of weight I liked, a tangible reminder of self-sufficiency. The trail was narrow and uneven. Every step required attention, and I had to navigate around roots, rocks, and sudden dips in the ground. Birds chirped occasionally, but mostly there was a suffocating silence, broken only by the occasional snapping of twigs under my boots or the distant rustle of leaves. I kept checking my map and compass, making sure I didn't stray. As the hours passed, the forest grew thicker, darker. The sun sank lower, filtering through the trees in thin golden beams that created more shadows than light. I arrived at the cabin just as the sun was dipping below the horizon. The structure was old but sturdy, made of rough timber and stone, blending almost seamlessly into the forest. A small wooden porch creaked under my steps as I set my bag down. The cabin smelled faintly of mildew and damp wood. Dust covered the surfaces inside, but it was dry, surprisingly clean considering how isolated it was. The windows were mostly intact, though some had cracks, and the door closed with a solid, echoing thump. I spent the next hour unpacking and organizing. I filled a small metal basin with water from the nearby stream, heated some for dinner, and laid out my sleeping area. The forest outside was dark now, almost complete black, with only occasional glimmers of moonlight sneaking through the branches. I lit a small lantern and sat near it, eating from my pack while listening to the forest settle. At first, everything was calm, almost comforting. But as night deepened, subtle sounds began to creep in, long, dragging noises, like something heavy moving across the underbrush, or the faint scratching of claws against bark. I tried to tell myself it was just deer, raccoons, or other wildlife. The cabin felt solid, and the door was locked. Still, the noises persisted, uncomfortably close at times. I kept imagining shadows outside the window, shapes that seemed to move just beyond my vision. Sleep didn't come easily. Every small sound, every gust of wind that rattled the roof made my heart rate spike. At some point, I realized the scratching noises had stopped, replaced by a soft but distinct thumping, coming from outside. Slow, measured, deliberate. It was not a deer or raccoon. I could feel it through the floor, through the wooden beams. My flashlight was on the table, just in reach. I hesitated for a long time, then gripped it and approached the window. Through the glass, I could barely make out movement. Something or someone was moving among the trees, circling, never getting too close, never fully visible. My mind raced with possibilities. A lost hiker, someone camping illegally, maybe even a hunter who hadn't seen the cabin yet. The rational part of my brain told me to stay put, that this wasn't unusual for remote areas. But another part of me, the primal, urgent part, screamed that this was not normal. I spent the next few hours on edge. I checked my supplies repeatedly, made sure the door was locked, and tried to keep myself calm. I reviewed my emergency options. The trail was too long to run, the forest too thick. If whoever or whatever outside decided to break in, I would be trapped. I stayed awake the rest of the night, sitting with my back against the wall, flashlight in hand, every sense focused on the forest. Morning brought relief, though it was only partial. The sun filtered through the trees, revealing the forest in detail, and nothing moved near the cabin. Tracks in the dirt suggested someone had been pacing near the edge of the clearing, but no footprints led directly to the cabin. I considered leaving immediately, but my car was hours away, and the trail was treacherous in daylight too. I decided to stay, but carefully prepared. I gathered some heavy sticks, sharpened a few rocks to use if necessary, and set traps around the perimeter with whatever I had on hand, mostly to make noise if someone approached. The day passed slowly. I tried to focus on mundane tasks: cleaning, preparing food, checking the water source. Still, every sound made me tense. I noticed that certain noises seemed repeated, the soft drag of boots or sticks against the dirt, moving in patterns that were deliberate. It was almost as if someone were studying the cabin, learning its weak points. I documented everything mentally, mapping the positions of noises, the timing, and possible entry points. Night returned. This time, I fortified myself as much as I could. I pushed furniture against the door, lined the windows with anything I could find, and kept my flashlight close. The sounds began again, deliberate, slow. Scratches at the siding, the faintest tapping on the roof, like someone walking across it very lightly. I stayed quiet, breathing slowly, listening. Hours passed. Eventually, the noises stopped. Exhausted, I allowed myself a short nap, sitting up, leaning against the wall, one eye always open. When I woke, it was nearly dawn. I felt a mixture of relief and determination. I had survived the night. The forest was quiet now. I stepped outside cautiously, examining the perimeter. No one remained. Whatever had been there had left, abandoning its interest. I decided it was finally time to leave. I packed everything carefully, leaving no trace of my stay. The hike back was tense but uneventful. My steps were measured, careful, and I constantly scanned the forest around me. Hours later, I reached the road where I had left the car. Relief flooded me as I started the engine, the familiar hum grounding me. I drove without pause, constantly checking the rearview mirrors and side windows, convinced that something could be following. When I reached the town, I stopped at a small diner to eat and process the experience. The fear lingered, but the knowledge that I had handled it, had survived entirely on my own, brought a deep sense of satisfaction. I reported the incident to local authorities, providing details about the tracks and the possible intruder. They noted it down and advised caution if I ever returned. I never went back to that cabin, but I learned something vital from the experience. The forest can hide more than animals, and isolation can make even small threats seem immense. I understood my limits, my ability to stay calm under pressure, and the importance of preparation. I carried this lesson with me not as fear, but as respect. Respect for the wilderness, for my own instincts, and for the thin line between comfort and danger in solitude. I had planned the cabin trip for months, carefully picking a spot deep in the forest, far from the main roads and towns. I wanted solitude, a chance to be alone with my thoughts and the wilderness. The cabin itself was small but sturdy, an old structure built decades ago by someone who clearly knew how to survive the harsh winters. It had a stone fireplace, a lofted sleeping area, and large windows that overlooked a small clearing surrounded by thick pine and oak trees. When I arrived, the sun was low, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I parked my old pickup truck on a rough dirt track that led to the cabin and unloaded my gear. It was heavy, but I felt a strange excitement as I carried everything inside. Inside, the air smelled faintly of pine and aged wood. Dust lay thick in the corners, and the floorboards creaked under my weight. I set down my backpack, laid out the camping stove and food supplies, and lit a fire in the fireplace. The sound of crackling would fill the room, and the warmth was immediate, comforting against the crisp evening air. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, and I could hear the faint gurgle of a stream nearby. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. The first night passed without incident. I slept in the loft, the mattress thin but tolerable, and the cold air seeped in through gaps in the walls, but it was bearable with a thick blanket. When I woke, the forest outside was quiet except for the occasional bird or squirrel. I spent the day exploring the surroundings, noting the small trail that led from the cabin down to the stream, where I found a flat rock that served as a good place to wash and fill my water bottles. The forest was dense, and the trees formed a natural canopy, blocking out most of the sunlight. There was a sense of isolation, but it was the kind I wanted, not the kind that felt dangerous. The second night, however, was different. I had cooked a simple dinner, hung my food in a tree away from the cabin as a precaution against bears, and sat by the fire for a while before climbing into the loft. As I lay in bed, the wind had picked up outside. It whipped against the cabin walls, rattling the windows and causing the floorboards to groan. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was normal for an old cabin in the forest. But then I heard it, a distinct, soft tapping on the wooden walls outside. At first, I thought it was a branch, but the tapping was deliberate, methodical, coming in short bursts. My stomach tightened. I listened intently, holding my breath. The sound continued for several minutes, then stopped. I told myself I was imagining things and eventually fell asleep, though fitfully, with one ear pressed to the floorboards above the ground. The following day, I explored further into the forest. I took the trail up a small incline, the undergrowth thick and sticky with pine sap and leaves. Birds flew up at my approach, and I startled a small deer that darted between the trees. The deeper I went, the denser the forest became, and I realized that I had lost sight of the cabin for long stretches. When I returned, I found small signs that someone, or something, had been close by the cabin. Footprints, large and heavy, partially obscured by fallen leaves, led from the tree-line to the cabin but did not continue past it. I compared them to my own boots and knew immediately that they were much larger. A chill ran down my spine. I had told myself all along that I was alone, but this evidence suggested otherwise. I reinforced the cabin as best I could. I checked the locks, piled firewood near the door to barricade it slightly, and kept my backpack with essentials close to the loft ladder. At night, I slept with one eye open. The tapping returned, sometimes in the middle of the night, sometimes just before dawn. I started to hear other sounds too, soft footsteps around the perimeter, the scratch of claws against wood, leaves crunching under weight too large for any forest animal nearby. My mind raced through possibilities. A bear? A stray hunter? Someone camping illegally nearby? Every scenario filled me with tension. By the third day, I realized that the situation was escalating. I had ventured outside only briefly to check the food stash, keeping a large stick in hand. The footprints had multiplied, circling the cabin, sometimes stopping as if whoever was tracking me was waiting for something. I began to notice small details. Broken twigs on the path to the cabin that hadn't been broken before. Subtle disturbances in the leaf litter that suggested a presence that was careful, deliberate, and patient. I started sleeping fully clothed, with the cabin door locked and the firewood pile strategically positioned to make noise if disturbed. During the day, I improvised traps. Nothing dangerous, just makeshift alarms to alert me if someone tried to approach. I strung thin wires across the entry path, attached cans that would clang if touched, and spread small piles of pebbles around the perimeter that would scatter if stepped on. I felt ridiculous, like a paranoid child, but the evidence of someone else's presence left me no choice. Every shadow seemed alive. Every crack of a branch set my heart racing. On the fourth night, the fear peaked. I had spent the day reinforcing the cabin further, nailing boards across the weaker sections of the wall and barricading the windows with whatever wood I could find. As darkness fell, I lit the fire early and prepared for a long, sleepless night. Around 2 a.m., the tapping returned, louder and more frequent, now accompanied by heavy, deliberate footsteps circling the cabin. I could hear breathing, deep and slow, almost human. My hand gripped the knife I kept in my lap, and I stared at the doorway, trying to remain calm. The intruder tried the door first, rattling it violently, then moved to the windows. I could see shadows moving outside, glimpses of a large figure through the gaps in the boards. I knew there was no immediate help coming. Cell service didn't reach this part of the forest, and I was miles from the nearest road. I was completely alone, facing someone, or something, that clearly intended to intimidate or harm me. I decided to act. Quietly, I grabbed a bag of heavy stones and climbed down to the floor, keeping low to avoid detection. I prepared myself mentally to confront the intruder if necessary. Then I remembered my truck, parked not far from the cabin along the dirt track. If I could reach it, I could drive to safety. I waited for a lull in the movement outside, then made a run for it. My heart pounded. My breath came in short bursts, and every snapped twig underfoot sounded like a gunshot. I reached the truck, jumped in, and locked the doors just as a shadow passed in front of the headlights. I started the engine and drove slowly at first, scanning the tree line for any signs of pursuit. The forest blurred past as adrenaline surged through me. Once I reached the main dirt road, I accelerated, the tires kicking up dust and gravel. I didn't stop until I reached a small town miles away. The lights, the noise, and the presence of other people felt almost unreal after days of solitude. I called the police, explained the situation, and they dispatched a unit to check the area. I gave them detailed descriptions of the footprints, the disturbances, and the cabin's location. Days later, the police reported back. The area had been used by a group of fugitives who had been hiding in the forest. They had been careful, avoiding detection, and occasionally checking the cabin as a temporary hideout. The footprints and disturbances matched reports of their movements. They had left the area by the time the police arrived, but the evidence confirmed my fears. I had indeed been tracked and observed. The relief I felt after knowing I was safe was profound. I never returned to the cabin, but the experience stayed with me, etched into my memory. I learned that the forest, while beautiful, could be unforgiving and dangerous in ways that were subtle, patient, and intelligent. The isolation I had sought had turned into a test of survival and awareness. I carried that lesson with me in every subsequent trip into the wilderness. Never underestimate your surroundings, always prepare for the unexpected, and trust your instincts when something feels off. Even now, years later, when I drive past forests and cabins, I remember the tension, the fear, and the adrenaline of that night. I remember the darkness, the tapping, the shadows that moved with intent. And I remember the relief of finally escaping, of knowing that my careful planning, quick thinking, and determination had kept me alive. That cabin in the woods was more than just a place. It was a reminder that isolation is beautiful only when it is safe, and that the line between peace and danger can be thinner than the wooden walls of an old cabin. I had been planning this cabin trip for months. I wanted isolation, time to myself, and a place where I could just escape the constant noise of the city. I wanted quiet so deep that even the occasional sound of my own breath seemed loud. I had found a small cabin listed online, tucked far away in the forest, at the end of a rough dirt road that few cars traveled. The photos made it look perfect. Wooden, rustic, with a small porch and a fireplace that looked like it had been there for decades. The cabin sat on the edge of a small clearing, with dense forest pressing in on three sides. I imagined walking the woods during the day, reading by the fire at night, and feeling nothing but the slow rhythm of my own thoughts. The first part of the trip went smoothly. The drive was long and exhausting. The road was narrow, covered with loose rocks and lined with trees that pressed over the car like green walls. Every turn felt like I was going deeper into another world, one where no one else existed. I arrived just as the sun was starting to dip below the horizon, bathing the clearing in orange and red. The cabin looked exactly like the pictures, maybe even more worn, more real, more solid. It had a smell: old wood, damp earth, and smoke that lingered faintly, probably from previous visitors. I parked my car near the porch, unloaded my gear, and stepped inside. The interior was dim but cozy. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and the air smelled faintly of dust and pine. There was a small kitchen area, a wood-burning stove, and a shelf filled with canned goods and old cooking utensils. A simple table and chairs sat near the window, and a narrow staircase led to a loft where the bed was. I set my bags down, lit a small lantern, and took a moment to just breathe. Everything felt peaceful, and the kind of quiet that made your own heartbeat feel louder than usual. I made a small dinner on the stove, nothing fancy, just something to fill my stomach, and sat by the fire, staring at the flickering flames. The first night passed uneventfully. I slept in the loft, which was tight but comfortable. The windows were small and covered with simple curtains, so the darkness outside seemed complete. The wind whispered through the trees, making the walls of the cabin groan, but it was soothing. It was the kind of place that made you feel both safe and aware of the forest pressing in around you. The next morning, I decided to explore. I packed a small day bag with water, snacks, and a flashlight. The trail behind the cabin was overgrown but passable. I moved slowly, taking in the forest. Birds were everywhere, but otherwise the woods were still. The path curved, rose, and fell, leading me deeper into the forest than I had expected. I walked for hours, the sun climbing higher and brighter, casting shadows that shifted with every step. Around midday, I came across a small creek. The water was cold and clear, and I paused to drink, filling my bottle and resting on a moss-covered rock. The sound of the water was soothing, and for a moment, I let myself relax completely. As the afternoon wore on, I realized I had wandered further than intended. The trees here were older, denser, and the trail became almost invisible. Every few steps, I had to push branches aside or step over fallen logs. I made a mental note of landmarks, the shape of a particular tree, the bend in the creek, thinking I could retrace my steps. But as the sun began to lower, I noticed something that unsettled me. The forest had grown unnaturally quiet. No birds, no insects, no rustle of leaves. Just me and the wind moving through the higher branches. The silence felt heavy, and I realized my heart was beating faster than it should. I stopped and looked around. The creek was still to my left, and I tried to follow it back, but the path had disappeared completely. I walked carefully, trying not to make too much noise, and kept glancing at the sun to estimate direction. Soon, I realized I had no idea which way the cabin was. Every tree looked the same. Every shadow felt like it was hiding something. My stomach twisted into knots as I realized I could easily get lost in this forest. I decided to stay calm and rational. I had my phone, although I had no cell service out here. I had a flashlight, a compass app on my phone, water, and some snacks. If I stayed put until morning, I could find my way back with daylight. But as I looked around, the forest seemed to close in. The shadows stretched longer, the air grew colder, and every sound, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, made me jump. I kept moving slowly, trying to backtrack along the creek, but the terrain grew rougher. Rocks and roots made my footing unstable, and every wrong step sent a jolt of panic through me. It was then I heard it, a low, deliberate snapping sound in the distance. Not like a branch falling naturally, but like someone stepping on it. I froze, holding my breath, listening. The sound repeated, spaced out, and I realized it was following me. Not directly, but close enough that I knew someone or something was moving in my general direction. My mind raced. I had planned for bears, maybe snakes, but not people lurking in the forest, unannounced. I kept moving, trying to stay calm, but the fear was clawing up my chest. The next few hours were terrifying. I moved cautiously, listening for sounds behind me, trying to follow the creek. Darkness was falling fast, and the forest became a maze of shadows and shapes. I stumbled over roots, scraped my hands against branches, and felt sweat and cold mix on my skin. The snapping sounds continued intermittently. Sometimes they were closer, sometimes farther, but they never stopped. The thought that someone might be watching me, waiting, filled me with dread. Eventually, I found a small clearing, barely wide enough to see the sky. I paused to catch my breath, my hands shaking. I knew I couldn't stay in the open, but hiding in the forest seemed worse. I remembered the cabin and made the decision to move at a steady pace, trying to stay quiet and make it back before it got too dark. My heart felt like it would explode in my chest as I followed faint signs I remembered from my earlier walk. The bend in the creek, the mossy rock, the old tree with a forked branch. Each step was tense, every sound amplified in my mind. Finally, after what felt like hours, I saw a faint outline through the trees, the cabin. Relief hit me like a wave. I broke into a run, stumbling over roots, ignoring the scratches on my arms and legs. When I finally reached the clearing, the porch light was already dim, and I fumbled with the door, throwing it open and collapsing inside. I locked the door immediately, checked the windows, and realized I had been terrified for nothing, or maybe for something I would never see. I sat by the fire, trying to calm down. My hands and legs shook, my stomach was twisted, and I felt the exhaustion settling into my bones. I tried to rationalize everything. The snapping could have been a deer, an animal, or just my imagination. The fear, though, was real, and it had almost overwhelmed me. I cleaned my minor scrapes, drank some water, and tried to eat something small. I knew sleep would be difficult, but I also knew I had to rest. That night, I stayed in the loft with the flashlight close. Every sound outside made me jump. Every shadow seemed alive. I kept checking the door, the windows, and the small porch outside. Dawn could not come fast enough. The night felt endless, and the fear of being followed, lost, or trapped in the forest was almost unbearable. I kept telling myself to stay calm, to stay rational, but my body betrayed me with every tremor and spasm. Morning finally arrived, pale light filtering through the small windows. The forest looked completely different in daylight. The trees, the creek, the rocks, all familiar now, made me realize how little I had seen at night. I stepped outside carefully, scanning for any signs of movement. Nothing, just the forest, still and quiet. I breathed in deeply, feeling the tension leave my body, but a sense of vigilance stayed with me. I decided to pack carefully and plan my departure. I wanted to stay longer, but the experience had shaken me. The idea of being isolated, followed, or trapped in that forest at night had left a mark. I gathered my belongings, double-checked the cabin, and set out slowly along the dirt road back toward the main highway. The drive back was quiet, the forest receding behind me, and every turn on the road reminded me of how close I had been to getting completely lost. By the time I reached the city, I was exhausted, dirty, and still tense, but also profoundly relieved. I realized that fear, in the right circumstances, could be overwhelming. The forest, the isolation, the darkness, it all combined into something raw, real, and uncontrollable. I never forgot that trip. I never forgot the way the snapping of twigs sounded like footsteps, or how easily I could have lost myself in the darkness. The cabin had been beautiful, the forest mesmerizing, but the experience taught me the value of preparation, caution, and respect for isolation. I never returned to that cabin, but I never forgot it either. The memory stayed with me, a reminder of how fragile safety can feel when the world suddenly becomes silent, dark, and unpredictable. I had always liked the idea of being completely alone in the woods, away from the city, away from people, noise, and the constant hum of life that never seemed to stop. I had spent months planning this trip, looking for a small cabin that I could rent in the mountains. I wanted something simple, something that felt remote, where I could sit for days without hearing anything but the wind through the trees. When I finally found the listing, it seemed perfect. A small, old wooden cabin tucked into a dense forest, with a narrow dirt road leading to it, far from any main roads or towns. The pictures showed an untouched interior, a stone fireplace, and a view of a small clearing behind the cabin. There were no neighbors visible, and from what the owner told me, it was rare for anyone else to be around. The drive there had been long, much longer than I expected. The narrow dirt road twisted and turned through dense forest, with branches brushing the side of my car and the occasional deer jumping across the road. By the time I arrived, the sun was low in the sky, spilling long shadows across the clearing in front of the cabin. The building itself was simple, made of rough logs with a tin roof that had patches of rust. The door creaked when I opened it, and the smell hit me immediately. A mix of damp wood, dust, and something faintly sour that reminded me of old leaves. I dropped my bag and took a moment just to look around. The place was exactly what I wanted. Isolated, quiet, and untouched. I spent the first few hours exploring the cabin and the surrounding area. Inside, there were simple furnishings. A small table, 2 chairs, a bed, and a few shelves with old, worn books. There was a wood stove that looked like it had been used recently, though the ash was cold. I checked the windows. They were small and dirty, but intact. Outside, the clearing behind the cabin stretched for about 50 feet before the forest pressed in again. The trees were thick, mostly pine and oak, and I could see patches of moss growing on the trunks. I walked along the edge of the clearing, trying to memorize every tree, every fallen branch, every slight dip in the ground. I wanted to know the space around me, to feel like I belonged in it. As night began to fall, I built a fire in the wood stove. I had brought enough wood to last for the night, and I stacked it carefully, listening to the soft crackle as the flames licked the dry logs. The light from the fire made the cabin feel warm and safe, though the darkness outside pressed against the windows like a weight. I ate a simple dinner from canned beans and bread, and then I sat on the edge of the bed, staring into the fire. The silence was profound. I could hear the occasional crack of a branch outside, the rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush, but there was no wind, no rain, nothing except the distant sound of the forest breathing. That night I slept uneasily. I had been alone in cabins before, but something about this place felt different. Around 3 in the morning, I woke to a sound outside. At first I thought it was the wind or a branch falling, but then I heard it again. A scraping noise, like someone dragging something across the dirt near the clearing. My heart started to race. I stayed perfectly still, straining to hear. The sound stopped, then started again, further away, then closer, then stopping abruptly. I told myself it was an animal, a deer maybe, or some raccoon knocking over a log. I forced my mind to calm down, and eventually I drifted back to sleep, though it took hours. The next morning, I decided to go exploring further into the woods. I wanted to understand the terrain, to make sure I could navigate it if I needed to leave quickly. I packed a small bag with water, snacks, a first aid kit, and my phone. The forest was dense, and the dirt paths were narrow and winding. I spent hours walking, paying attention to landmarks. A fallen tree with a deep groove, a boulder with moss growing in stripes, a stream that cut through the trees. The sunlight filtered through the canopy in slanted beams, and the air smelled sharp and clean. I felt a strange mix of exhilaration and tension, alone, but completely aware of everything around me. By late afternoon, I noticed something that made me stop. There were footprints in the dirt, not far from the clearing near the cabin. They were large, human, and fresh. My stomach turned over. I had expected to see deer or small animals, but humans? I followed them quietly for a few steps, trying to determine their path. The prints were heading deeper into the forest, away from the cabin. I debated whether I should go back immediately, but curiosity and a strange sense of caution made me continue observing. The footprints ended abruptly at a patch of dense underbrush. There were no signs of where the person had gone, no broken branches, no movement, but it was clear someone had been there recently. When I returned to the cabin, I decided to lock the door carefully, checking the windows twice. I kept the fire going and I stayed close to it, listening. Night fell, and with it, a sense of unease that I could not shake. Around midnight, I heard it again, the same scraping sound, this time much closer. I froze, listening as it moved along the edge of the clearing. I tried to tell myself it was an animal, but the rhythm and weight of the steps sounded human. Then I heard a branch snap right outside the cabin, and I knew someone was there. I didn't panic immediately. Instead, I moved quietly to the window, looking out into the blackness. First, I saw nothing. Then, a shadow moved behind a tree near the edge of the clearing. I could make out a human figure crouched low, watching the cabin. My heart pounded, and I realized I had no way of knowing if this person was armed, dangerous, or just curious. I considered running, but the darkness, the dense trees, and the uneven ground made it risky. I decided to wait, to observe, and to be ready to react. Hours passed. The figure didn't move much, staying near the same tree, seemingly patient. I stayed as quiet as possible, barely breathing. I realized I was unarmed, completely exposed if they decided to come closer. I thought about my options. I could stay inside, but that might trap me. I could try to escape to my car, but the dirt road was long, dark, and unfamiliar. My mind raced with every possibility, every outcome, none of them good. I had been looking forward to this trip for months, planning every detail down to the last meal I would cook and the exact trails I would hike. I wanted a weekend away from the city, from the noise, from the constant hum of people and traffic and work, and the cabin I rented was perfect, or so it seemed. It was in a dense forest, several miles from the nearest road, a small wooden structure with a stone chimney, built on a gentle slope above a small, murky lake. The idea of complete isolation had always appealed to me, but as I drove down the narrow dirt road, winding between thick pines and oaks, A small voice inside my head whispered caution, a warning I chose to ignore. The cabin itself looked exactly like it had in the photos. 2 stories with a porch that wrapped around the front and side, windows so large they would let the forest in during the day. The moment I stepped out of my car and felt the smell of damp pine and wet earth, I felt a brief thrill of freedom. I carried my bags inside, setting them down near the main living area, and immediately noticed how quiet it was. Not just the kind of quiet that comes from being far from civilization, but a heavy, thick quiet that pressed against your ears and seemed to settle into your chest. Even the wind seemed muffled. I spent the first hour exploring the cabin, taking in the little details. The wood panels on the walls, slightly warped from age. The stone hearth, cold and empty. The small kitchen with a rusty but usable stove. Everything was simple, functional, and lived in. There were traces of the previous tenants. A forgotten mug in the sink, crumbs in the corner of the floor, the faint scent of smoke lingering in the living room. Nothing alarming, just signs that I was not the first to enjoy the isolation of this place. As night fell, I built a fire in the hearth, the crackle and warmth filling the cabin. I had brought food, enough to last the weekend, and I cooked simply: pasta, canned vegetables, some bread. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the forest in a dark, almost suffocating shade. I sat in the chair closest to the fire, a blanket over my knees, the only light coming from the flames. Outside, I could hear the occasional rustle of leaves, the distant call of a bird, the water of the lake lapping against the shore. It was peaceful in a way, but also strange. There was an emptiness in the forest at night, a sense that it was watching. Around 10, I decided to check the locks on the doors and windows. Everything seemed fine. The cabin was old, yes, but solid. I went to bed early, exhausted from the drive and the hike I had taken that afternoon. The bed was surprisingly comfortable, a simple mattress on a wooden frame, and I fell asleep quickly, the sound of the fire dwindling as it burned down to embers. I woke up in the middle of the night to a faint scratching sound. At first, I thought it was an animal outside, perhaps a raccoon or a deer brushing against the wooden siding. But the sound was deliberate, rhythmic, almost too large to be a small animal. I lay in bed, straining to hear, my heart beginning to pick up pace. The cabin creaked under its own weight, old with settling in the cold night, but the scratching persisted. I got up quietly, wrapping the blanket around my shoulders, and went to the window. Outside, it was pitch dark. I could barely make out the trees, the outlines of branches swaying. I pressed my face to the glass, trying to see movement, anything. There was nothing. I returned to bed, telling myself it was probably a branch scraping against the side of the cabin. Still, sleep did not come easily. Every little noise made me tense. Every shadow in the room seemed to shift with intent. The next morning, I resolved to explore the area, to occupy my mind and prove to myself that there was nothing to worry about. The forest around the cabin was dense and uneven. The ground was damp from recent rain, and small streams cut through the undergrowth, making hiking difficult. I stuck to a faint trail leading to a clearing where the sun managed to break through the canopy. Birds were active now, their songs piercing the silence, and I felt a sense of relief, a small reassurance that life went on here as it always had. I spent the day hiking, taking photos, collecting small memories. When I returned, I noticed a set of footprints in the mud near the cabin. Large, wide, and irregular. My stomach sank. They didn't belong to any animal I recognized. They were human, and they were recent. I checked the perimeter of the cabin, looking for signs of someone else, but saw nothing. No other tracks, no discarded items, no signs of forced entry. I told myself it was probably someone else hiking in the area, a hunter maybe, and tried to shake off the unease. That night, the scratching returned, louder, closer. I could hear it now on the porch, the slow, deliberate tapping against the wood. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, but deep down I knew it wasn't. I stayed in bed, eyes wide, blanket clutched to my chest, listening. The scratching moved along the side of the cabin, circling, deliberate, patient. Then suddenly it stopped, and in the silence that followed, I could hear breathing, not my own. I lay frozen, straining to detect the direction, but the darkness seemed to swallow sound. I thought about calling someone, my phone, but there was no signal. I was completely alone, trapped in a wooden box in the middle of the forest. The rational part of my mind screamed to stay calm, to remember the basics. The cabin was solid, the doors locked, no one could get in easily. But another part, a visceral, instinctive part, screamed that I was not safe. I stayed awake the rest of the night, fire long extinguished, listening. At dawn, I finally ventured outside. The porch was intact, no signs of forced entry, no footprints leading away from the cabin. But then I noticed something else. The locks on the back door were slightly scratched, as if someone had tried to tamper with them. Panic rose in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. I needed a plan. Over the next few hours, I secured the cabin as best I could. I checked all the windows, wedged chairs against the doors, and made a makeshift alarm using pots and pans tied with string near the doors. I spent the day preparing food, gathering water, and planning my escape. I would wait until nightfall, then drive back down the forest road, stick to the main highway, and not look back. But as night fell again, the sounds returned. Not just the scratching this time, but footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. I could hear the crunch of leaves under heavy boots, the faint click of metal, maybe a knife or some tool. My heart pounded so hard I was sure it would give me away. I stayed perfectly still, blending with the shadows of the room, listening as the footsteps moved closer, then paused, then moved again. I could smell the cold air, damp wood, and something metallic, like iron, carried faintly on the wind. Hours passed. I didn't sleep. The intruder circled the cabin, over and over, as if testing me, probing, waiting. I kept thinking about how close I had come to ignoring the first signs, how easy it would have been to underestimate the situation. By dawn, the sounds ceased. Exhausted, I stayed where I was, barely moving, until I was sure it was safe enough to act. When I finally dared to leave, I found that someone had left marks on the cabin. Scratches along the walls, deep gouges near the corners, signs of tools or knives. Nothing had been stolen. Nothing had been taken inside. It was a message or a warning. Whoever had been here had the skill to remain unseen, to come and go without leaving evidence of their passage. I packed my things silently, checking the perimeter one last time. No one was in sight. The forest was silent, the only sound the occasional bird or squirrel. I drove down the dirt road as fast as I dared, eyes scanning the trees for movement, hands gripping the wheel so tight they ached. I didn't stop until I reached the highway, where the familiar hum of cars and civilization washed over me. I didn't look back at the forest, the cabin, or the road I had traveled. The experience stayed with me for years. The scratches, the footsteps, the deliberate silence, the feeling of being watched, hunted, tested. I never returned to that forest. Eventually, I came to terms with what had happened. It wasn't a ghost or a fantasy or a trick of my imagination. It was human, and human beings were far more dangerous than anything I had imagined. The cabin was safe in its structure, but not in its location. Out in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by people who could be patient, quiet, and skilled, safety was an illusion. That was the lesson I carried with me. The world could be calm, beautiful, and inviting on the surface, but beneath that surface, danger could be patient, waiting, and invisible. I never stayed in a cabin alone again. I had been planning the trip for months. I wanted to get away from everything, to find some kind of solitude that would let me breathe without the noise of the city, without the constant hum of people and cars and lights that never seemed to switch off. The cabin I found was tucked deep in the woods, far from any roads that were properly maintained, far from any signs of civilization. From the pictures online, it looked perfect, rustic but solid, with thick wooden walls, a stone fireplace, and a view of a small frozen lake that reflected the trees like a mirror. The reviews had been sparse but positive. People said it was remote, peaceful, and just what someone needed to escape. I didn't realize how much remote actually meant until I got there. The drive itself had been rough. I left late in the afternoon, the sun hanging low behind the mountains, casting long shadows that crept across the road like dark fingers. The map showed a small route leading to the cabin, a series of winding dirt roads that got narrower with every mile. Eventually, I had to abandon the car and hike the last stretch because the path was too rutted and slick with mud. My backpack was heavy with food, water, a sleeping bag, and some extra clothing, but it felt manageable. I thought I was prepared. I always thought I was prepared. When I finally arrived, the cabin sat like a dark, solid block between the trees, almost hidden, but unmistakable. The sun was nearly gone, and the forest seemed to hold its breath as I approached. The air was cold, sharper than I expected, and the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves filled my nose. I unlocked the cabin and stepped inside. The interior was dusty, untouched for at least a few weeks, but it felt clean enough. I set my backpack down near the door, lit the fireplace, and unpacked what I needed for the night. I didn't realize it yet, but the feeling of being watched had started almost immediately. Tiny, almost imperceptible, like the trees outside were leaning closer than they should have been, like the shadows cast by the fire flickered just a little too fast, a little too erratic. I brushed it off. I told myself I was tired and imagining things. The first night passed uneventfully, except for the wind. It howled through the trees like it was alive, scraping against the windows and rattling the walls. I couldn't sleep well, waking often, listening to the branches knocking and cracking. Each time I opened my eyes, the room seemed darker than it should have been, deeper shadows in the corners, the ones furthest from the fire. I told myself again it was the angle of the light, the trick of a tired mind. By morning, I had decided to explore the surrounding area. I needed to know the woods to get a sense of the layout, to feel safe or at least less anxious. The trail around the lake was narrow, almost overgrown, but manageable. The snow underfoot crunched with every step, and the air smelled of pine and wet earth. I kept to the path, noting how quiet everything was. No birds, no squirrels, no wind aside from a low rustle in the treetops. It was the kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes your heartbeat seem too loud. I walked for hours, circling the lake, climbing a small ridge, and marking landmarks mentally so I could find my way back. It was peaceful, but the quiet was so deep it started to feel oppressive. By the time I returned to the cabin, my legs were sore, my boots caked with mud, and my stomach was empty. I lit the fire again, ate a simple dinner of canned food, and tried to relax. But when night fell, the cabin felt different, heavier somehow. The shadows seemed to move differently, not because of the fire, but because of the angle of the room. The wind had died, but the quiet wasn't comforting anymore. It was waiting. The second day was when I started noticing things that didn't make sense. At first, it was small footprints in the snow near the cabin that weren't mine. I had been careful to wipe my own prints down from the porch, and I knew the snow hadn't fallen overnight. The prints were fresh, leading from the tree line to the cabin and back. They were human-sized, but they didn't belong to me. I froze when I saw them, staring at the ground, tracing the path with my eyes, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was another hiker? Maybe someone had a cabin nearby? But there were no other structures, no other roads, nothing on the map. I shook my head and decided it was just a deer track that looked oddly human. My mind wanted explanations that made sense. I tried to keep myself busy. I chopped wood for the fireplace, cleaned the cabin, checked the perimeter for any other signs of intrusion. Everything looked normal except the footprints. But as the evening came, I found more signs. Small things that unsettled me. A branch bent near the side window, as if someone had looked in. The latch on the back door slightly moved, even though I had locked it. The windless trees seemed to whisper in the darkness. I tried to convince myself I was imagining it all. Cabin life was supposed to be isolated. Isolation can make shadows move on their own. Isolation can make you hear sounds that aren't there. That was my mantra. I repeated it over and over. Then, on the third night, it escalated. I was asleep when I woke to a sound. A sharp, deliberate knock at the door. My heart stopped. The cabin was small, the walls thin, and every sound echoed in the still night. I sat frozen in bed, listening. No wind, no branches. Just the knock again, slower this time, measured. My first thought was that someone had found me, maybe a hunter, maybe someone lost. But the thought of anyone being in these woods, finding a cabin this hidden, seemed unlikely. I kept quiet, straining to hear. The knock came again, then silence. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, I was paranoid. I didn't see footprints outside. No marks, no traces, nothing. I convinced myself that maybe I had dreamed it, that exhaustion had created hallucinations. I kept the fire going constantly that day, fortified the doors with extra wood I had chopped, and stayed near the windows, watching the tree line. I could feel eyes on me, though I couldn't see anyone. I told myself it was the woods, the isolation, the heightening of senses. It had to be. I had to rationalize it. The following day, I explored further from the cabin, trying to tire myself physically so my mind wouldn't dwell on the fear. I followed a small creek that led uphill, the water frozen in places, ice sharp and brittle underfoot. It was beautiful, deceptive in its calmness. I stayed alert, listening for anything unusual, and for a while I felt in control again. I even found an old hunting trail and followed it, marking the trees with pieces of cloth from my pack. But on the way back, I noticed fresh footprints near the creek, heading parallel to the trail I had just walked. I froze. These prints were definitely human, bigger than mine. Someone had been there recently. I couldn't tell who or why, but I knew it wasn't an accident. I hurried back to the cabin, adrenaline pumping, and barricaded myself in for the night. Every creak of the floor, every sigh of the wood in the cold night made me jump. I barely slept, too tense to even relax by the fire. Over the next days, the signs increased. Small things at first. A can of food moved from where I left it, tiny scratches on the doorframe, footprints circling the cabin at irregular times. Then more alarming things. The back door left unlocked, even though I remembered locking it. The firewood stacked neatly, then knocked down. Whoever or whatever was there, they were careful, patient, observing. I realized it wasn't a random hiker or animal. It was deliberate. Someone was watching me. Maybe someone had been in the woods for longer than I had realized. Maybe someone had been living off the grid and didn't like strangers. The thought made my stomach twist. I started carrying a heavy metal rod at all times, checking every corner, every window, every shadow. I stopped going far from the cabin. I didn't trust the trail anymore. I barely left the firelit main room. Then came the worst night. I was lying awake, heart racing, listening to the occasional rustle outside. Around midnight, I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. Not in the snow, but the thin forest floor, soft, careful. They stopped occasionally, then continued. At one point, I could hear something scraping against the door. My hand was on the rod. I knew I couldn't run, couldn't call for help. No signal. No one would find me. I waited. Hours passed. The sound continued, sometimes close, sometimes further. I stayed motionless, praying daylight would come. Finally, I fell into a fitful, shallow sleep just before dawn. When I woke, the cabin was quiet, eerily quiet. I checked the perimeter carefully. Nothing. No footprints, no disturbance. But one thing caught my eye. The latch on the back door had been damaged. Someone had tried to break in. My heart sank. I realized that staying here, alone, was a risk I could no longer ignore. I packed what I could carry, food, water, the essentials, and prepared to leave. I waited until late morning, daylight, and started the hike back to the road. Every sound, every movement in the trees made me flinch. I walked quickly, taking only the main trail I had marked earlier, making mental notes of landmarks, the frozen creek, the ridge, the lake edge. It took hours, but eventually, I reached the road. My car was where I had left it, though half buried in mud and snow. I locked the doors, got inside, and didn't stop driving until I hit the main highway, the safety of other cars and traffic surrounding me like a protective wall. The experience left me shaken. I told myself over and over that I was lucky, that I had gotten out in time. The cabin itself was not dangerous inherently. It was solid, warm, and remote. But being alone, cut off, and observed had turned it into a trap. After that trip, I never went back. I researched the area, trying to understand if anyone had ever reported similar things. But there was nothing. No history of violence, no reports of squatters, nothing. Just me, and the reality that isolation can be dangerous, that humans are unpredictable, and that sometimes just being alone in the wrong place can be terrifying. I kept the memory close, the details vivid, as a warning to myself. The cabin had promised peace, but it had almost taken more than I was ready to give. In the end, I survived because I trusted my instincts, because I stayed alert, and because I had prepared as best I could. I learned that fear is not always irrational. It is sometimes the clearest indicator of danger. And I learned that solitude, while beautiful, carries risks that cannot be ignored. The memory of the cabin remains, etched into my mind, not as a place of calm or retreat, but as a reminder that being alone in the wild can be more frightening than any story, any myth, any imagined terror. Real danger is patient, quiet, and very, very real. I had been looking forward to this weekend for weeks. The idea of a quiet cabin in the woods, away from the city noise and work, was irresistible. I packed carefully, making sure I had enough food, water, and supplies for 3 days. The cabin was supposed to be small but cozy, right on the edge of a dense forest. I had never stayed alone in a cabin this isolated, but I thought I was prepared. The drive was long, winding along narrow roads lined with tall pine trees, their shadows stretching across the pavement even in the middle of the afternoon. As I drove, I noticed how quiet it was getting. The occasional bird or distant rustle of branches was the only sound, and the further I went, the less I saw of any other human being or car. It felt good at first, peaceful in a way I had never experienced in the city. When I finally reached the cabin, it was everything I expected. Small, wooden, slightly worn but well-maintained. The forest surrounded it on all sides, dense enough that I could not see far into it. A narrow dirt path led up to the front door, and I parked the car nearby, stretching my legs after the long drive. The air smelled clean, a mixture of pine, damp earth, and smoke from chimneys far in the distance. I carried my bags inside and took a long look around. The interior was simple but functional: wooden floors, a small kitchen with basic appliances, a table, chairs, and a fireplace with stacked logs. There was a bed in one corner, a small bathroom, and a few shelves with old books and kitchenware. I decided to unpack slowly and make myself comfortable before exploring. After setting things in order, I went outside to take a look at the surroundings. The forest was thick, almost unnervingly so. Every tree looked the same in the dim light of late afternoon, and shadows stretched long across the uneven ground. A narrow trail ran alongside the cabin, disappearing into the trees. For a while, I walked slowly along it, observing birds and small animals, trying to enjoy the quiet. Night began to fall faster than I expected. Darkness moved quickly among the trees, and soon the cabin was surrounded by a heavy, almost tangible blackness. I lit the fireplace and made a small dinner, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling that had started to creep into my mind. It was silly, I thought. I was alone in the woods. I had prepared for this. Still, every little sound, the creak of a branch against the window, the rustle of leaves, made me tense. I kept telling myself it was all normal, that the forest was alive with sounds, but I could not shake the sense that something was watching. I went to bed early, hoping sleep would calm my nerves. The cabin was silent except for the occasional creak of the wooden beams as the wind moved outside. I lay awake longer than I wanted to, listening to the small noises that seemed amplified in the dark. A distant thud, a branch falling, the low whistle of wind through the trees. Then, just as I was drifting off, I heard it, a soft scratching sound outside the cabin, near the back. At first, I thought it was a branch brushing against the wall, but it was too deliberate, too rhythmic. Scratch, pause. My heart started to race. I got up quietly, careful not to make noise, and peeked through the window. The darkness outside was complete. I could see nothing except the faint outline of trees. I tried to convince myself it was a deer or some other animal, but the sound did not match anything I had ever heard. It moved in a slow, methodical way, circling the back of the cabin. I could hear the crunch of leaves under feet that were not mine. I considered calling someone, but the cell signal was weak, barely enough to send a text. I kept the lights off, hoping it would go away. Hours passed, and I stayed awake, listening to the sounds that seemed to be all around me now. Sometimes, I thought I could hear breathing, low and slow, outside the cabin walls. I tried to remember that this was all in my head, that fear could make sounds seem larger, more deliberate. The next morning, I found footprints in the soft dirt behind the cabin. They were human, large, heavy boots, and they had not been there the day before. Panic hit me immediately. I checked the doors and windows. Everything was locked, just as I had left it. The footprints stopped abruptly near the trees, as if whoever had made them had vanished into the forest. I spent the morning examining the perimeter, noting where the tracks led, and trying to figure out what to do. The nearest neighbor was several miles away, and there was no immediate way to get help quickly. I decided to stay inside for the day, staying near the windows to watch for any movement outside. As the day went on, the forest remained eerily quiet. It was almost too quiet, with no birds, no rustling, nothing. I realized that whatever had been there the night before had not left entirely. The tension in the air was thick. Every small sound made me flinch. I made myself a meal, walked around the cabin repeatedly, and tried to keep busy, but the unease never left. By the second night, I had barely slept. Every creak, every rustle outside made me feel trapped. The fire I had lit burned low, casting shadows across the walls, making them look like they were moving. Then I heard it again, soft, deliberate scraping at the back of the cabin. This time it was closer, more confident. My hands shook as I grabbed a kitchen knife from the drawer. I considered leaving, running to the car and driving away, but I had parked it a little distance from the cabin, and the forest around was dense and dark. Running would be dangerous. I spent the night in a constant state of alert, moving quietly from window to window, trying to see through the shadows. Occasionally, I thought I saw a figure, just at the edge of vision, blending with the trees. I kept my breathing slow, trying to avoid drawing attention. I waited for hours until the first light of morning. When I finally dared to step outside, the footprints were gone, as if they had never existed. The forest looked normal again, but the feeling of being watched lingered. I stayed another day, trying to enjoy the forest in daylight, but I avoided going too far from the cabin. I checked the doors repeatedly, secured the windows, and kept my knife nearby. The air felt heavy, tense, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I took careful note of every sound, every movement, but nothing unusual happened in the daylight. I realized that whoever had been there had likely been hiding, patient, waiting. That thought made me even more cautious. On the third morning, I decided it was time to leave. I packed quickly, double-checked the cabin, and kept my eyes on the trees the entire time. The drive back felt endless, the road winding and narrow, with every shadow along the side making me tense. I kept my doors locked and the radio on, hoping the sounds of civilization would calm me. By the time I reached the main highway, I felt relief flood through me, a mix of exhaustion and gratitude that I had made it without incident. After that weekend, I never stayed in an isolated cabin again. I realized that the woods were not friendly in the way I had imagined, that isolation could turn peaceful nature into something threatening. The footprints, the sounds, the feeling of being watched, they were all real, and they stayed with me long after I left the forest behind. I never saw anyone, never discovered who or what had been there, and part of me hoped I never would. The experience left a permanent mark, a reminder that solitude in the wrong place can be dangerous, and that sometimes fear is rooted in things we cannot explain, even if they are completely real. I had been planning the trip for months, making sure everything would be perfect. I needed a break from the city, from the constant noise, the crowded streets, and the endless pressure of work. I wanted isolation, a place far from anyone else, where I could breathe freely and think. The cabin I found online seemed ideal. It was old but sturdy, tucked deep in the woods, away from the main roads, with a small creek running nearby. The photos online made it look cozy, almost inviting. I imagined myself there, surrounded by trees, reading books, writing in my journal, and sleeping without the interruption of sirens or car horns. I didn't even care that the nearest town was over 30 miles away. I arrived on a Friday afternoon. The road leading to the cabin was long and narrow, winding between tall pines and thick undergrowth. The sun was already beginning to sink behind the trees, casting long shadows across the dirt path. My car bounced over hidden rocks and tree roots, and I gripped the steering wheel tightly, reminding myself that once I reached the cabin, everything would be worth it. The GPS signal had disappeared long before the last few miles, and I had to rely on a hand-drawn map I had received from the owner. When I finally spotted the cabin through the trees, it looked smaller than in the pictures but still solid, with dark wooden walls and a stone chimney. Smoke rose faintly from the chimney, though the cabin was empty. The first thing I did was unpack, dragging my bags inside and setting up the essentials. I had brought food, water, blankets, and a small camping stove. The cabin had a wood-burning stove as well, which I decided to light immediately, not just for warmth but for comfort. The fire flickered and hissed, the smell of burning wood filling the room, and for a while I felt completely at ease. I explored every corner of the cabin. The small bedroom with its rickety bed, the kitchen with simple utensils and a tiny pantry, and the main room, which had a few chairs, a table, and shelves filled with old books. Everything was dusty but usable. The first night was quiet, almost unnervingly so. I lay in bed listening to the wind rustling through the trees outside, the occasional crack of a branch, and the faint trickle of the creek. There were no cars, no people, no distant sounds of civilization. The silence was complete, except for the occasional animal noises that I barely recognized. At first, it was soothing, but as the hours passed, it started to feel heavy, almost oppressive. My mind, which I had expected to calm in this isolation, began to wander. I kept thinking about how far I was from help, how easy it would be for someone or something to approach without me knowing. The next morning, I went out to explore the area around the cabin. The forest was dense, and the sunlight barely reached the ground in some places. I followed the creek upstream for a while, noting the way the water glinted over stones and the moss that covered everything. The air smelled clean, earthy, and damp. I found some animal tracks, probably deer or raccoons, and made a mental note to be careful, especially after dark. I returned to the cabin before noon, feeling satisfied with my small adventure. The rest of the day passed uneventfully. I chopped firewood, cleaned the cabin a bit, and cooked a simple meal over the stove. The second night, the isolation felt heavier. I could hear the creek more clearly now, and the forest noises seemed sharper. An owl hooted somewhere far away, and I realized how alone I truly was. I checked all the doors and windows multiple times, making sure they were locked and secure. I went to bed earlier than the first night, trying to ignore the unease settling in my chest. Around midnight, I was awakened by a sound that froze me in place. It was faint at first, barely noticeable over the creaking of the cabin and the wind outside, but I could hear it clearly enough to know it was human. The sound of someone walking in the woods, crunching the fallen leaves under their feet. I stayed perfectly still, holding my breath, straining to hear. The steps were slow, deliberate, and moving closer. My first thought was that it could be a neighbor or a hiker, but the nearest person was miles away, and I hadn't seen anyone else all day. The sound paused, as if the person was standing still, listening. My heart pounded, my hands clammy. I wanted to wake up, shake myself out of it, tell myself it was a dream, but the sound was real. I considered going outside to confront whoever it was, but my instincts screamed against it. I stayed in bed, motionless, listening until the steps moved away again, fading into the distance. The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about the footsteps. I checked the perimeter of the cabin, but there was no sign of anyone. No footprints, no disturbed foliage, nothing to indicate someone had been close. Still, the sense of being watched remained. I spent the day busying myself with chores, chopping more wood, organizing my supplies, and exploring a small path behind the cabin, but I felt eyes on me constantly. I didn't see anyone, but I could feel the tension building. That night, I barely slept. Every little noise startled me. A branch snapping, the wind rattling the cabin, the creek gurgling over rocks. Around 2 a.m., I heard the footsteps again, this time much closer, almost at the edge of the clearing near the cabin. They paused, then retreated slightly. I stayed awake the entire night, clutching a heavy flashlight and a small hatchet I kept by the bed. By morning, I was exhausted, my body tense, my nerves frayed. The following day, I decided I couldn't just sit and wait for something to happen. I needed a plan. I scouted the area around the cabin more thoroughly, noting every path, every tree, every possible hiding spot. I found signs that someone had been in the woods recently. Broken branches, faint footprints, and even some discarded wrappers that weren't mine. It became clear that the footsteps were not random. Someone was deliberately nearby, watching. The thought made me feel sick, but I knew panicking wouldn't help. I fortified the cabin as best I could, stacking firewood against the doors, checking the windows, and making sure my phone and car keys were easily accessible. That night, the footsteps returned, louder and more confident. I didn't sleep at all. I spent the hours crouched near the window, peering into the darkness, trying to make out shapes. At one point, I thought I saw someone moving between the trees, a shadow against the faint moonlight. I kept the hatchet in my hand, ready to defend myself if necessary. The hours dragged on, each minute stretching into an eternity. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud and frantic, as I watched for any sign of movement. The next morning, I realized I couldn't stay any longer. The isolation that had once been peaceful had turned into fear, and I didn't want to wait until the intruder became bold enough to approach the cabin. I packed my things quickly but carefully, keeping my senses alert. Before leaving, I walked around the cabin one last time, checking for signs of the intruder. I noticed something I hadn't before: a series of footprints leading toward the creek, deeper into the forest. They were fresh, and they seemed to have circled the cabin several times. I felt a chill run down my spine, realizing how long I had been watched without noticing. I got into my car, locked the doors, and drove slowly down the winding dirt road, constantly scanning the woods. Every shadow seemed like a figure. Every sound made me flinch. The road seemed endless, the isolation stretching behind me like a living thing. I didn't stop until I reached the main highway, where the familiar hum of traffic and distant lights finally made me relax slightly. Even after I returned home, the memory of that cabin haunted me. I realized that the forest, which had seemed so peaceful and serene in the daylight, had been a trap in the dark. The isolation that I had craved had made me vulnerable, and the sense of being watched had been real. I had expected solitude and peace, but what I found was tension, fear, and a reminder that human danger can lurk where you least expect it. I never went back to the cabin. I researched the area later and discovered that the forest had a reputation among locals for transient criminals hiding out or people living off the grid. It explained the footprints, the intrusions, and the sense of being watched. I realized how lucky I was to have escaped without an encounter, without confrontation. I knew I had learned a harsh lesson about isolation, vigilance, and the reality of human threats in remote areas. I kept the cabin experience in my mind not as an adventure, but as a stark reminder of caution. Over time, I started to recover from the experience, but the tension, the fear, and the sense of being watched stayed with me for weeks. I found myself double-checking locks, being more aware of my surroundings, and carrying something for protection whenever I went into the woods near home. The memory of that night, the footsteps, and the sense of unseen eyes lurking in the darkness became a reference point in my mind for how quickly peace can turn into danger. Looking back, I realized that the trip had given me more than just a story of fear. It had taught me resilience, awareness, and the importance of preparation. I had survived a situation where isolation and vulnerability could have cost me dearly, and I had learned to respect the unseen dangers that can exist even in places that appear safe. The cabin, the forest, and the footsteps remained vivid in my memory, not as a haunting, but as a clear, detailed lesson in survival and human caution. I made a rule for myself after that. Never assume safety in isolation, never underestimate the potential for human danger, and always plan for the unexpected. I continued to spend time outdoors, but always with preparation, awareness, and caution. The experience at the cabin became a foundation for understanding risk, reading the environment, and recognizing that sometimes the scariest things are not supernatural or fantastical. They are simply real, human, and unpredictable. The lessons I learned in that remote, silent forest shaped how I approached life afterward, and I carried that clarity with me every time I ventured into the wilderness. I had been looking forward to this weekend for months. Work had been suffocating. The constant hum of emails, meetings, and deadlines pressing down on me like an unshakable weight. I wanted nothing more than to disappear for a few days, to escape into the wilderness, away from the noise and constant expectations. I had found a small, isolated cabin online, a place far from towns, neighbors, or even reliable cell service. The pictures promised solitude, thick trees surrounding the property, and a little creek that ran just beyond the cabin's back porch. I didn't need luxury. I wanted silence, space, and time to breathe. The drive was longer than I expected. I had mapped it out carefully, making sure I knew every turn, every mile marker, and yet, by the time the gravel road leading to the cabin stretched out in front of me, I was already feeling the tension start to ease. The trees closed in around me as I drove, tall pines and oaks forming a wall of green on either side. The air smelled different here, sharper, cleaner, almost tasting like pine needles and damp earth. When I finally pulled into the small clearing where the cabin sat, I realized the true isolation of the place. There were no other buildings, no sounds of cars, no distant voices. Just me, the cabin, and the forest. The cabin itself was simple but solid. Its wooden exterior was weathered and gray, blending perfectly into the surrounding forest. The porch was small but sturdy, and the windows, though dusty, were intact. I parked my car on the uneven grass and stepped out, taking a deep breath. The wind rustled the leaves above, carrying with it a chill that made my skin prickle. There was a creek nearby, just as the listing promised. I could hear it faintly, the soft murmur of water against rocks. I carried my bag inside and set it down on the floor. The interior was rustic, rough wooden walls, a small kitchen area, a fireplace with a stack of firewood nearby, and a loft above that could serve as a sleeping area. The place smelled faintly of mildew and old wood, but it was not unpleasant. I took a moment to run my hand along the walls, feeling the grooves in the wood, and tried to imagine what it would be like to live here for more than a few days. I could see the appeal, the quiet, the freedom, the complete separation from the outside world. I unpacked my supplies and set out to explore the immediate area. The cabin sat at the edge of a small clearing, surrounded by dense forest on three sides. Behind the cabin, the creek wound through the trees, its water clear and cold. There were signs of wildlife everywhere. Tracks in the dirt, claw marks on trees, and the occasional rustle in the underbrush. I felt a thrill, the kind that comes from being in a place that is alive in ways that a city never could be. The first night came quickly. I had built a fire in the fireplace and sat on the floor, back against the wall, listening to the crackle of the flames. Outside, the wind had picked up, moving through the trees and carrying strange, unidentifiable sounds. I tried to relax, telling myself it was only the forest settling, animals moving about, or branches rubbing together. But there was a tension in the air, subtle and unrelenting, a sense that something was just beyond my sight. I shook my head and focused on the fire, pouring myself a cup of coffee from the thermos I had brought. The warmth of it, combined with the glow of the fire, calmed me enough to sleep. The next morning, I woke early, the sunlight streaming through the windows and warming the room. I made myself a simple breakfast, eggs and toast, and then set out to explore further. The forest was dense but navigable, and I followed the creek upstream, enjoying the rhythm of the water and the way the light moved through the branches. Birds called out intermittently, and the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush reminded me that I was not entirely alone. I kept a knife strapped to my belt, more out of habit than necessity, and I felt a strange mix of exhilaration and vigilance as I wandered. It was on the second evening that the sense of unease began to grow stronger. I had returned from a long hike, my legs tired, my boots muddy, and the sun was dipping below the treetops. The wind had picked up again, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and decay. As I approached the cabin, I noticed something odd. There were footprints in the soft earth near the edge of the clearing, too large to be mine and too irregular to be from an animal. I stopped and stared at them, my heart starting to beat faster. They led from the edge of the forest toward the cabin and then seemed to disappear near the tree line on the other side. I checked the doors and windows, making sure everything was locked. Nothing seemed amiss inside, and yet the feeling of being watched clung to me like a second skin. I built the fire early that night, making it burn hot and high, and I sat close to it, my eyes scanning the shadows that the flames cast across the walls. Every sound outside, the wind, the creak, the occasional snapping of a branch, set my nerves on edge. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the forest was alive with natural sounds, but the tension did not ease. Sleep came fitfully. I woke multiple times to strange noises. The crack of a branch, the scuff of something heavy moving outside, the sound of something or someone breathing in the dark. Each time, I sat up, knife in hand, listening, straining to identify the source. I told myself I was overreacting, that isolation did strange things to the mind, but the fear persisted, gnawing at me. By morning, I was exhausted, my body tense, my mind restless. Over the next 2 days, I tried to keep busy. I cleaned the cabin, collected firewood, and explored more of the surrounding area. I started marking trees and setting small traps for wildlife, just to give myself a sense of control. Yet the unease never fully left me. On the third night, it escalated. I had gone to the creek to fetch water and noticed something strange. There were more footprints, this time closer to the cabin, and they seemed fresher. They were human, unmistakably so. I felt a cold wave of fear wash over me. Someone had been near my cabin while I was away, someone who had left no other signs of their presence. I returned quickly, carrying the water and my nerves with me. I double-checked every window, every door, and even barricaded the front door with a heavy chair. I moved the firewood pile closer to the door, something that made no logical sense, but it felt like a defensive gesture. I sat by the fire, knife in hand, listening to every sound, my ears straining for the slightest disturbance. I did not sleep that night, dozing only briefly between shifts of alertness. Every shadow seemed to move with intention. Every gust of wind felt like it carried someone's presence. On the fourth day, I decided I needed to make a plan. I packed my bag lightly, keeping essentials within reach. I inspected the car, making sure it was ready to go, the tank full, the doors locked, and the keys easily accessible. I could not shake the feeling that someone was out there, someone who had been watching the cabin, tracking me. I spent the day preparing for an emergency exit, mapping out the path back to the main road, noting landmarks, and calculating how long it would take to get there if I had to move quickly. As night fell, the wind grew even stronger, rattling the windows and whistling through the cracks in the cabin walls. I stayed near the fire, listening, every muscle tensed. Around midnight, I heard it, the soft crunch of footsteps on the gravel near the cabin. My heart pounded violently. I held my breath, gripping the knife, and tried to control my shaking hands. The footsteps moved closer, then stopped, and I could hear the faint scrape of something against wood. Panic rose in me, but I forced myself to remain calm. I could not let fear dictate my actions entirely. I waited, every nerve screaming, until the sounds faded. I decided then that I could not stay another night. I would leave at first light, using the map I had memorized to navigate through the forest and reach the main road. I would not take any chances. The hours until dawn were torturous. I sat awake, fire dying down to embers, knife on my lap, listening to the forest come alive with noises that now felt menacing rather than peaceful. When the first light finally broke, I moved quickly but quietly. I packed the remaining supplies, secured the cabin as best I could, and slipped out the back door. The forest seemed less threatening in daylight, but I kept my senses sharp, eyes scanning constantly. The path I had marked the day before guided me, and I moved swiftly, stepping carefully over roots and rocks, aware that the forest could conceal many things. Hours later, I emerged onto the gravel road. Relief washed over me in a wave so strong it made my knees weak. I could see my car in the distance, parked exactly where I had left it. I ran the last stretch, fumbling with the keys, my heart still racing, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I climbed in, locked the doors, and started the engine. The cabin was behind me now, a small gray structure swallowed by the forest, but its presence lingered in my mind. As I drove back toward civilization, the sense of danger slowly ebbed. The sun rose higher, illuminating the familiar signs of human habitation, and I allowed myself to breathe deeply for the first time in days. I knew I would be shaken for a long time, that the memory of those footsteps and the feeling of being watched would not easily fade. But I had made it out. I had planned carefully, stayed alert, and acted decisively. I survived. I never returned to that cabin, nor did I ever take another trip into such complete isolation without careful planning. But the experience left me with a strange sense of clarity. It was a reminder of how quickly solitude could shift into vulnerability, how easily comfort could turn into fear, and it was a lesson in awareness, preparation, and the power of paying attention to small details that others might overlook. I carried it with me, the memory sharp and vivid, a cautionary tale of what it means to be truly alone, and yet to survive. Even now, I can picture the cabin, hidden among the trees, the creek flowing quietly behind it, and the shadowed edges of the forest where I first realized how close danger could come without warning. That experience has stayed with me, a permanent imprint on my mind, but it also gave me confidence. Proof that careful observation, preparation, and calm determination could carry me through even the most unnerving of circumstances. I was shaken, certainly, but I was alive, and that, above all, mattered. I had always wanted to spend a week alone in the woods. Not for meditation, not for peace, just to see if I could handle it. Life in the city had become too loud, too full of people who expected me to keep up with schedules, calls, messages, everything always demanding something. The idea of a small cabin, far away from any other house, tucked deep in the forest, sounded perfect. The cabin wasn't fancy. It was the kind of place someone might rent if they wanted complete isolation for a few days. Wooden walls, a small stove, a few old chairs, a bed with a thin mattress, and a table by the window that faced a clearing. The cabin had no internet, no television, and barely any electricity. A generator could be run if needed, but there was no guarantee it would start every time. I liked that. The thought of depending on nothing but myself was the challenge I wanted. I arrived in the late afternoon, the sun already beginning its slow descent behind the trees. The forest was dense here, tall pines and oaks that grew so thickly I could hardly see past the first layer of trunks. The path to the cabin was rough, overgrown, and full of roots that threatened to trip me at every step. My backpack was heavy with supplies. Food for the week, water, extra clothes, first aid kit, flashlight, batteries, and a small axe. The air smelled like pine and wet earth. A light breeze rustled the branches, carrying the faint smell of something smoky in the distance. Probably someone else's campfire, though I could not see any smoke rising above the treetops. The cabin came into view as the path opened into a small clearing. It was simple, square-shaped, made of weathered logs, with a small porch and a rickety railing. The windows were dusty, the glass streaked with water marks, and the door creaked ominously as I pushed it open. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood and something slightly sour, like damp fabric that had been closed up too long. Dust covered most surfaces. I set down my backpack and took a moment to absorb the silence. Not the peaceful silence I had imagined, but a heavy, watchful silence. There were no birds singing, no insects buzzing loudly, just the faint whisper of wind moving through the trees. It felt alive, but not in the friendly way of a forest full of animals. I set to work immediately. First, I unpacked the essentials, stacked firewood near the small stove, and filled a few jugs with water from a creek nearby. I checked the stove, found the matches, and soon had a small fire going. The cabin began to feel less like a forgotten building and more like a temporary home. As the sun dipped lower, shadows stretched across the floorboards and walls, making the corners darker than I expected. I tried not to think about the fact that at night, this cabin would be swallowed completely by darkness. I cooked a simple meal and sat by the stove eating. Outside, the forest had changed. The breeze had stopped. The air was colder, denser, as if it had weight. I realized I could hear something faint, soft thuds, like branches being stepped on, coming from somewhere deep in the woods. First, I thought it was deer. Deer could move like that, quiet and careful, barely touching the ground. But there was no pattern to the noise, no regularity. Sometimes it came from one direction, then another. The sound of movement kept me alert, though I told myself it was only animals. Night fell completely, and with it came the kind of darkness I had not experienced before. The kind of darkness where you can't tell if something is just behind a tree or if your mind is playing tricks. I lit a candle and placed it on the table by the window, hoping its weak light would chase some of the shadows away. It did not. The shadows moved anyway. Then I heard it clearly. A crack, like a branch breaking under weight. It was right outside the window. My first instinct was to look, but my body froze. I didn't want to see, didn't want to confirm that someone or something was out there. The crack came again, closer this time. I grabbed the flashlight and aimed it out into the blackness. Nothing. Just trees. Just darkness. But I knew it wasn't nothing. The night stretched on. Every time I thought I had grown used to the sounds of the forest, another noise would snap me awake. I realized I hadn't heard the normal forest noises at all. No birds, no insects, not even the wind through the trees. It was just silence, punctuated by movement. Small steps, occasionally a branch snapping. Sometimes the sounds circled the cabin. By the second night, sleep became impossible. I kept the fire burning and stayed near it, axe within reach. I tried to make sense of what was happening. Could it be a person? Someone watching, waiting? That seemed the most realistic. The forest was too thick for animals to make that many small, careful movements so consistently around a single point. And the sounds weren't random, they had purpose. They seemed deliberate. I spent the day reinforcing the windows. I hammered thin boards over the broken panes I found, checked the locks, and made sure the door was as secure as it could be. I also moved the heavier items, chairs, small table, against the door just in case. My hands shook as I worked. The forest outside seemed alive, though I could not see movement clearly. I could only hear it. The forest seemed to be watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. The third night I heard a voice. Not a clear voice, not words, but a low murmur, almost a whisper, carried on the wind. Came from just beyond the clearing. I froze. I tried to tell myself it was the wind rustling through branches, but it was too precise, too human-like. My heart raced. I realized then that I was not alone. Someone was out there, somewhere in the woods, and they had been here longer than I had. I decided to stay awake until first light. I barely moved from the corner near the stove. Every noise made me jump. The whispers came again, faint, then louder, circling the cabin. I felt my mind start to slip into panic, but I forced myself to focus. There had to be a way out if things got worse. I checked my backpack for the spare batteries in my flashlight. I counted matches. I thought about the axe in my hand, about the creek nearby. Escape was possible, but only if I stayed calm. Morning finally came. The first light was weak, gray, and the forest looked entirely different under it. What had felt so alive at night now seemed just quiet. Maybe the person had left. Maybe they had gone to sleep. I didn't wait to find out. I packed as quickly as I could, left the cabin in order so it looked untouched, and started along the path. Every sound made me flinch. Every movement in the trees made me pause. I didn't want to look, but I had to keep an eye out. The trek back was longer than I expected. The path was rough, the roots catching my feet again and again. I felt a presence behind me several times, and I did not dare turn. I only ran when I could, stumbling through thick underbrush, avoiding low branches, ignoring scratches that tore at my clothes and skin. Hours later, I reached the dirt road that led to the nearest town. I could see a car coming down the road, headlights cutting through the morning haze. Relief washed over me in waves I could not stop. I waved frantically, got into the car, and immediately told the driver the briefest explanation. He did not seem shocked, just concerned. I later returned with authorities to check the cabin, though I had no intention of staying there again. The cabin was empty. No one had broken in. No traces, no footprints. The boards I had reinforced were intact. Nothing appeared to have moved. The authorities said it was likely just animals. I wanted to believe that. I wanted to convince myself that the fear I had felt was only my imagination. But I knew better. The forest had been alive with something. Someone had been out there, watching. I didn't know what they wanted, and I didn't want to know. I had made it out. That was enough. I didn't try again. I didn't attempt isolation in the woods. I didn't even hike alone anymore. The forest had taught me one lesson, clear as day. There are places in the world where being alone is not freedom, it is exposure. Being alone can be dangerous, and you may not even know what is out there, waiting for you to slip, waiting to see how you react. I never forgot the sounds of those nights, the way the darkness pressed in, the way the forest seemed aware of me. And I never, ever went back. The cabin remains there. I drive past it sometimes on my way to other places. From the road, I can see the clearing, the small porch, the windows that reflect the sunlight in the daytime. It looks calm, peaceful, but I know it isn't. The forest keeps its secrets, and some of them are not meant to be found. I had been planning the trip for weeks, mapping out the small cabin in the middle of the forest that I had rented. It was supposed to be a simple getaway, a place where I could escape the constant noise of the city and the endless responsibilities of work. I wanted peace, solitude, and a chance to reconnect with myself. The cabin was a small wooden structure, old but sturdy, tucked far away from the nearest road. According to the description, it had no electricity, no cell reception, just water from a nearby creek and a wood stove. Perfect, I thought. Perfect to disconnect and reset. The drive out there was long and winding. I left in the morning, the sky still pale with dawn, and the air crisp and cold. The roads narrowed as I went further into the forest, twisting between dense trees and crossing over small creeks with wooden bridges that creaked ominously under the car's weight. As I drove, I felt a mix of excitement and unease. I had been to cabins before, alone, but this one felt different. More remote, more vulnerable. I shook off the feeling, telling myself it was just the isolation getting to me, and kept driving. By late afternoon, I reached the clearing where the cabin stood. It was more isolated than I imagined, surrounded by tall pines and firs, the forest floor littered with fallen leaves and pine needles. The cabin itself was modest. Dark wood, a small porch, a chimney that promised warmth. I parked and stepped out, stretching, breathing the sharp, earthy scent of the forest. The silence was almost tangible. No cars, no voices, not even birds singing. Just the wind through the trees and the faint murmur of the creek nearby. I unloaded my things. A duffel bag with clothes, food supplies, and some essentials. A lantern, a first aid kit, matches, and enough wood to last a few days. I checked the cabin carefully. The door was old but locked, the windows dirty but intact. Inside, it smelled of damp wood and the faint musk of past visitors. There was a small kitchen area with a rusted sink and shelves with canned goods left behind, probably by the owners. A small wood stove sat in the corner, blackened from use. The furniture was basic: 2 chairs, a small table, a bed with a thin mattress. It wasn't luxurious, but it was functional. I started a fire in the stove, stacking the logs carefully, feeling the warmth slowly fill the room. The daylight was fading fast, and I was grateful for the fire. Shadows stretched across the walls, twisting in shapes that made me glance over my shoulder. I tried to focus on practical tasks, setting up my sleeping area, checking the lanterns, but the feeling of being watched crept in slowly. It wasn't rational. I was alone. No one could be here, and yet that unease stayed with me. The first night was restless. I lay on the bed, listening to the forest outside. At first, it was comforting, the rustle of leaves, the occasional snap of a branch, but then it became unsettling. Every sound seemed amplified in the dark. I heard something moving outside, slow, deliberate. I told myself it was probably a deer or a raccoon. Still, I couldn't shake the sense that something was observing me, just beyond the clearing. I stayed awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind, the creak, every creak of the old cabin settling around me. I didn't sleep well, waking several times to the sounds outside, heart pounding, imagining shapes in the shadows. The next day, I decided to explore the area, to convince myself I wasn't trapped in a cage with unseen eyes. The forest was dense, the path barely visible under fallen leaves. I walked along the creek, stepping carefully over slick rocks. The air was damp and cold, carrying the smell of wet earth and pine. I found a small trail leading deeper into the woods. It seemed unused, rough, with branches snapping underfoot. I walked for a while, keeping track of the direction, marking trees with small scratches to find my way back. The forest was eerily quiet, and I noticed that every sound, my footsteps, the rustle of leaves, the distant water, echoed more than it should have. It made me uneasy. I had always liked the forest, but here, it felt oppressive, like the trees themselves were closing in on me. By late afternoon, I returned to the cabin, my legs sore, my stomach empty. I set about preparing a simple meal, heating water on the stove, frying some canned vegetables and beans. The fire crackled, the smell of cooking filling the small room. It was grounding, a small reminder that I was safe, at least for now. But as night fell again, the cabin felt different. The shadows seemed darker, more numerous. The wind rattled the windows. The noises outside seemed closer, sharper. I tried to read a book to distract myself, but I couldn't focus. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made me startle. I kept checking the windows, the door, imagining someone or something just beyond the trees. On the third night, things escalated. I was lying in bed when I heard it. A deliberate knock at the cabin door. My heart froze. I froze. No one should be here. The cabin was miles from the nearest road. No one would walk out here at night. I stayed perfectly still, straining to hear more. Then silence. I told myself it was the wind, a branch hitting the door, but it had been sharp, controlled, a knock, not a random bang. I waited, holding my breath. Nothing else happened. I didn't sleep much that night, firewood at hand, knife under the pillow. The following day, I explored the perimeter of the cabin. The forest was even denser than I remembered. I walked slowly, listening, keeping my senses sharp. The creek was close by, and I used it as a reference point. That's when I noticed something. Footprints. They were faint, almost washed away by overnight rain, but they led from the tree line to the cabin. Small, human-like, but not mine. I followed them cautiously. They didn't lead far, disappearing into the undergrowth. My stomach turned. Someone had been here, possibly watching. I felt a mix of fear and anger. How could they have approached without me noticing? The isolation that once seemed peaceful now felt like a trap. I spent the next day on high alert. I barricaded the door with a chair, stacked logs near the windows, tried to make the cabin feel less vulnerable. I didn't go far from the porch, afraid of being followed in the forest. The sense of being watched never left me. Shadows outside seemed to shift unnaturally, and every sound, rustling leaves, snapping twigs, made me jump. I rationed my food and water carefully, unsure how long I might be trapped if someone decided to stay nearby. I even considered leaving the cabin, but the forest around it was dense, and I didn't know the trails well enough to find my way back safely. It was a cage, and the bars were made of trees and darkness. Night fell again. I stayed up, tending the fire, listening to the wind, the creek, the forest. That night, I heard voices, low murmurs, indistinct, carried on the wind. They weren't close enough to make out words, but close enough to be human. Panic surged. I stayed in the cabin, moving quietly, heart racing. Every creak of the floorboards, every tap of rain against the roof made me flinch. I kept my knife close, ready for anything. The night passed slowly, painfully, each hour stretching endlessly. When dawn finally came, I was exhausted, tense, and barely functional. I knew I couldn't stay here much longer. The isolation and fear were eating away at me. I spent the day carefully packing my essentials. I didn't want to leave the cabin empty-handed in case I had to defend myself or if someone tried to take anything. I also collected enough wood to keep the fire burning for a short time after I left, to avoid any sudden alarms. As I prepared, I plotted my escape. Follow the creek downstream, it might lead to a road. Keep low, stay alert, move quietly. I left a small note on the table, more for my own sanity than for anyone else, stating my departure and where I might go. It was a symbolic act of reclaiming control. I waited until late afternoon, when the light was still strong but shadows long. I grabbed my pack, slung it over my shoulder, and left the cabin. I moved quietly through the trees, careful to avoid making noise, following the creek as best I could. Every step was tense, every rustle of leaves a potential threat. Hours passed. My legs ached. My arms were sore from holding branches aside, my throat dry from fear and exertion. But I kept going, driven by the need to reach safety. By evening, I finally emerged from the forest onto a dirt road. Relief washed over me in waves, almost physically, as if the weight of weeks of fear and tension had been lifted. I flagged down a passing car, grateful beyond measure when the driver agreed to take me to the nearest town. Once there, I called the authorities, reported the cabin and the footprints, and gave a detailed description of the surrounding area. They didn't find anyone, but they did note signs that someone had been living in the woods nearby, possibly observing the cabin. In the end, I returned to the city, exhausted but alive. The experience stayed with me for weeks, haunting my thoughts in quiet moments. But I also felt stronger, more aware, more capable of handling fear and uncertainty. I realized how thin the line was between safety and vulnerability, how quickly solitude could turn into isolation and fear. And while I swore I would never go back to that cabin, I also knew I had survived something real, tangible, and terrifying, and I had come out the other side. I had reclaimed my life from the forest and the unknown eyes that had watched me. I had faced the fear that came from nothing supernatural, nothing mystical, just another human being's intrusion, and I had survived it with clarity and resolve. I had been planning the trip for months. It was one of those impulsive ideas that I told myself was going to be simple, relaxing, and entirely disconnected from the chaos of my normal life. I rented a small cabin deep in the woods, somewhere remote enough that the nearest town was at least a 40-minute drive away. The listing described it as rustic but cozy, and it had no electricity, just a wood stove and a generator that worked when needed. The idea of being completely alone with nothing but nature around me seemed both terrifying and exhilarating, and I wanted to feel that isolation fully. The drive there was uneventful but long, winding through dense forest roads that were barely marked. Every so often, a clearing would open up, giving me glimpses of a distant mountain range covered in thick trees, a mixture of pines and maples, their colors muted under the cloudy sky. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was just beginning to dip behind the mountains, giving the forest a soft, golden hue. The cabin was smaller than I expected, a simple wooden structure with a stone chimney and a small porch. It looked abandoned in some parts, the wood weathered, but it had a certain charm that appealed to me. I parked the car and stepped out, stretching my legs after the long drive. Inside, it smelled faintly of damp wood and old pine needles. Dust clung to the corners of the room, and the furniture was sparse but functional. A small table, a couple of chairs, a bed with a thin mattress, and a wood stove in the corner. I set my backpack down and started exploring. There was a tiny kitchen area with a sink, a stove, and a small fridge. It ran on a generator, and thankfully it worked, though it made a low, humming noise that felt odd in the quiet cabin. The windows were small, letting in minimal light, and I realized quickly how dark it would be once the sun set completely. I spent the first hour unpacking and arranging my things. I made a small fire in the stove to warm up the cabin and took inventory of the supplies I had brought. Canned food, a few snacks, bottled water, a first aid kit, flashlights, extra batteries, and a small camping stove just in case. I had also brought a hunting knife and a hatchet, items that seemed excessive at the time but felt necessary in such isolation. The quiet in the cabin was almost overwhelming. Even though I was surrounded by trees, I could hear almost nothing besides the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant calls of birds returning to their nests. Night fell quickly. Without any electricity, the darkness was complete, and the fire was my only source of light. I ate a simple dinner, sitting at the table, listening to the wind through the trees. At first, the quiet was peaceful, but after a while, it became unnerving. Every sound, the creak of the cabin settling, the snap of a branch outside, the rustle of an animal in the underbrush, felt magnified. I tried to focus on my breathing and remind myself that I was alone but safe. Around midnight, I realized I hadn't secured the cabin properly. I had closed the doors but hadn't locked the windows. I got up to check, using the dim light from the fire. The windows were old and had simple latches. I locked each one and made sure the door was firmly shut. Even after securing everything, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was out there. My mind tried to rationalize it. There was no one. I was in the middle of a forest, miles from civilization. Still, I couldn't ignore the unease creeping through me. That night, sleep was light and fitful. Every small noise made me wake up, my body tense. I thought I heard footsteps around the cabin, slow and deliberate. At first, I convinced myself it was just the wind or an animal moving near the walls. But as the minutes dragged on, the sound became distinct, almost like someone pacing outside. I didn't dare open the door or window to check. My heart raced as I lay in the bed, listening. The pacing continued for what felt like hours, and then, suddenly, it stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than the noises before, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. By morning, I was exhausted but relieved to see the sunlight breaking through the trees. I stayed inside most of the day, trying to gather my thoughts. I kept checking the perimeter of the cabin from the small windows, looking for signs of intrusion. There was none, only the forest, dense and indifferent. I told myself it had been an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but something about the rhythm of the footsteps didn't match any animal I had ever known. I prepared food and ate cautiously, keeping one ear attuned to any movement outside. The second night was worse. The feeling of being watched grew stronger. I noticed tracks around the cabin, deep prints in the mud leading from the edge of the trees to the cabin walls. They were human-sized, heavy, and deliberate. I didn't want to confront the reality, but there was no denying it. Someone had been near the cabin while I slept. I checked the locks again and even jammed the door with a chair, hoping it would give me some sense of security. The wind howled outside, but I was sure I heard voices, low, indistinct murmurs, carried by the breeze. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat by the fire, knife in hand, listening to the forest and watching the windows. The next day, I knew I had to make a choice. Staying in the cabin felt unsafe, but leaving meant facing miles of dense forest with only the sun and a vague map for guidance. I packed essential items into my backpack: food, water, first aid, knife, and a flashlight. I also filled a water bottle from the cabin's sink, careful to ensure it was clean. Before leaving, I checked the doors and windows one last time. Everything seemed in order, but the tracks from the previous night were still visible, though partially washed away by rain. I left the cabin mid-morning, taking a path I had scouted on the map. The forest was thick and progress was slow. Every step brought a new challenge: fallen trees blocking the path, thick undergrowth catching at my legs, and the constant worry of someone following me. I moved cautiously, listening to every sound. Birds took flight at my approach, and small animals scurried through the underbrush. I tried to focus on the goal, making it to a road or a town, but the feeling of being watched never left me. By late afternoon, I reached a small clearing. It was a modest break in the forest, with sunlight pouring through and a small stream cutting across. I stopped to rest and drink water. That's when I noticed something disturbing. Fresh footprints leading away from the stream toward the deeper forest. They were different from the ones at the cabin, lighter, smaller, but still human. My heart sank. Whoever had been near the cabin was not only nearby but moving through the same forest I was in. Panic surged, but I forced myself to stay calm. I needed a plan. I decided to stick to the terrain I knew. The map indicated a road about 3 miles away, winding through the forest. I kept moving, trying to make as much noise as possible to signal my presence, thinking perhaps it would deter anyone from following too closely. The forest seemed endless. Trees blurred together, and shadows deepened as the sun began to set. I forced myself to focus, taking slow, deliberate steps, constantly checking behind me. The footprints seemed to vanish at times, only to reappear moments later, as if whoever was following me was careful but not entirely stealthy. Night came quickly. I hadn't planned to be traveling in darkness, but I had no choice. I found a large tree with thick branches and climbed just high enough to feel somewhat hidden from the ground. I listened, barely breathing, as the forest seemed to come alive with every sound. There were rustles, snaps, and distant thuds that could have been animals or not. I stayed there for hours, trying to ignore the fear gnawing at me. Eventually, exhaustion overcame me, and I fell into a light, uneasy sleep. I woke before dawn, the forest still and quiet. I climbed down and continued moving, relying on the faint light to guide me. By mid-morning, I finally stumbled onto a dirt road, narrow and winding, but unmistakably a road. I could see tire tracks and a few signs indicating a small town not too far away. Relief washed over me in a way I had not felt since leaving the cabin. I increased my pace, walking as fast as I could without making too much noise. Eventually, I reached the edge of the town, where the first houses appeared, smoke rising from chimneys and the faint sound of daily life. I made my way to the nearest police station and reported what had happened, explaining the tracks, the noises, and my fear of someone stalking me in the forest. The officers were serious and took my statement carefully. They sent a patrol out to check the cabin and the surrounding forest. Later, I was told that the cabin had been used recently by someone, though no one was currently there. They found evidence of makeshift campsites nearby and confirmed that the tracks I saw matched those of a human, not an animal. In the following days, I stayed in the town, resting and recovering. I couldn't stop thinking about how close I had come to being trapped in the forest with someone who had watched my every move. But I also felt a sense of gratitude. I survived because I stayed alert, stayed calm, and made rational decisions under pressure. I learned the value of preparedness and the importance of trusting instincts, especially in situations where danger is real and unpredictable. Weeks later, I returned home. The experience left a mark, not just physically but mentally. I found myself double-checking locks, planning routes carefully, and thinking about survival strategies even in ordinary life. But I also carried with me a sense of accomplishment. I had faced real fear and uncertainty and emerged unharmed. The forest was vast and indifferent, but I had navigated it. The cabin, the footsteps, and the unseen observer remained a vivid memory, a reminder of how fragile our sense of safety can be when removed from the familiar. From that trip, I understood that fear is not just an emotion, it's a signal, a guide. And while it can be overwhelming, it can also keep us alive if we heed it carefully. I never returned to that cabin, but I never forgot it. Its silence, its darkness, and the constant presence of someone, or something, watching me became lessons I carried long after the woods and the fear were behind me. I never thought I would find myself so completely alone, trapped in a cabin far away from anyone or anything that resembled safety. It was a small wooden structure tucked in a valley between steep, forested hills, the kind of place you see on maps with nothing around it for miles. I had driven for hours on narrow, winding dirt roads, the kind of roads where one wrong turn could send you sliding down a hill with no one around to hear you scream. My car rattled and shuddered over stones and roots that jutted through the path, and the smell of damp earth mixed with pine filled the air. I had expected a quiet weekend, maybe some peace to myself. I didn't expect fear to crawl in the way it did. The cabin was old, with wooden planks darkened from rain and age. Moss had grown in streaks along the edges of the roof, and the chimney leaned slightly to one side as if it had survived 100 storms. There were no signs of modern life. No electricity, no running water, nothing except a rusty propane tank outside and a stack of firewood leaning against the side. The windows were covered with thin, dusty curtains that barely let in light, and the door creaked when I pushed it open. Inside, it smelled of damp wood and something faintly sour, maybe old cooking, maybe just the smell of an uninhabited place. I set my backpack down on the floor and started exploring. The cabin had a single room with a small kitchen area, a table, 2 chairs, and a wood stove. There was a narrow staircase leading up to a loft, where a thin mattress lay on the floor, yellowed sheets folded beside it. Everything was rough and basic. It was clear no one had lived here for some time, but it wasn't abandoned in the way you think of abandoned houses. It felt like it had been left in a hurry, like someone had gone and never returned. I lit the stove using the last of the matches I had brought and started a small fire. The warmth spread slowly through the room, the flames reflecting off the walls and ceiling in flickering, irregular patterns. I unpacked my food and supplies, trying to convince myself that I was fine. I had prepared for isolation, for silence, for the kind of solitude that came from being deep in the forest. And yet the quiet was oppressive in a way I hadn't anticipated. The wind outside howled through the trees, and branches scraped against the cabin like fingernails on wood. I thought it was the wind, but something about the rhythm, the way it started and stopped, made me uneasy. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay on the thin mattress in the loft, listening to the house creak and settle. Every noise seemed magnified. The soft shifting of wood, the rustle of leaves, the occasional snap of a twig outside. I kept imagining things, shadows moving at the edge of my vision, shapes that weren't really there. I told myself it was all nerves, that I was alone, safe, and nothing could hurt me here. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next morning, I explored the surrounding area. The cabin sat at the bottom of a small hill, with a creek running nearby. The forest was dense, and the underbrush made walking difficult. I followed animal tracks, trying to identify them, and found the remains of a small deer that had been scavenged, probably by a coyote or fox. Nothing about the forest seemed particularly threatening, but there was a sense of unpredictability that I couldn't ignore. I made a mental note to be careful. I returned to the cabin, and as the afternoon wore on, I noticed something strange. Footprints in the mud near the cabin weren't mine, and they weren't from animals. They were human, large, and irregular, as if someone had been wandering near the cabin without a clear purpose. I froze, my heart pounding. I hadn't seen anyone else on the road or in the forest, and yet there they were, fresh prints leading away from the cabin and back into the trees. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to leave immediately, to drive back down the dirt road and never return. But the road wasn't safe in the dark, and my phone had no signal. I had no choice but to stay. I locked the door and secured the windows as best I could, dragging a chair in front of the door to give me some sense of control. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a hiker, maybe someone else was just exploring. But I couldn't shake the image of the footprints and how deliberate they seemed. As night fell, the sounds outside changed. The wind grew quieter, almost dead. I heard movement in the forest, soft, deliberate footsteps, nothing like the scattered sounds of animals. It started far away and slowly, almost impossibly, got closer. I stayed on the loft, trying to be as still as possible. My eyes were fixed on the window, the shadows of trees moving with the faint moonlight. Every branch that snapped made me jump. The footsteps outside were slow now, careful, methodical. They weren't random. They were searching. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. Time lost meaning. I didn't dare move. The footsteps eventually stopped, right outside the cabin. My stomach turned to ice. I could hear breathing, shallow, controlled. Whoever or whatever was outside was waiting, listening. My mind raced. I considered hiding somewhere, but there was nowhere to hide. The loft gave me a vantage point, but it offered no escape. Then the door creaked. A faint sound, barely noticeable over the wind, but it was there. I pressed myself against the wall, holding my breath. Whoever it was tried the handle, then pushed lightly, testing. I could see the shadow of someone through the thin curtain. Panic threatened to overwhelm me, but I forced myself to stay calm. My only chance was to survive until daylight. I remembered the propane tank outside. I could try to make a distraction, create a fire that might drive them off. I risked peeking out through a gap in the curtains. The figure was there, tall, wearing dark clothing that blended with the shadows. Couldn't see a face. I grabbed a metal pan from the kitchen and swung it against the wall to create a loud, sudden noise. The figure flinched, took a step back, and vanished into the forest. I didn't wait. I moved to the back door, lifted the propane tank onto my shoulder, and went outside, dragging it to the far side of the cabin. I set it on the ground, lit a small fire near it, and let the flames spread to the dry grass around the tank. The crackling fire created a wall of noise and light, and I ran back to the cabin, locking the door behind me. I didn't sleep that night. I kept a pot of water boiling on the stove in case I needed to throw it, a large branch nearby as a weapon. The night felt endless, each minute stretching into eternity. But when morning came, the first light filtering through the trees, the forest seemed empty. There were no footprints near the cabin, no signs of the figure. The fire had died down, leaving blackened grass and smoke curling into the sky. In daylight, I explored again carefully. I marked my path, checked the surroundings, and discovered tracks leading away from the cabin, larger and more erratic than the human prints I had seen before. It looked like someone had wandered through the forest in a panic, maybe trying to avoid me or lose themselves. I realized I had survived the night because I had stayed calm, acted decisively, and never revealed my location until I had a plan. I decided it was time to leave. I packed up, double-checked the locks, and began the trek back down the dirt road. The forest seemed less threatening in the light, but I kept my senses sharp. Every rustle of leaves, every broken branch made me flinch. The journey down was slow, deliberate. My car was where I had left it, and as I drove away, I looked back at the cabin, small and silent in the valley. I had survived, but I knew I would never forget the fear of that night, the sense of being watched, and the realization that human threats could be far more terrifying than anything supernatural. Once I was on a paved road, back in range of cell service, I called the local ranger station. They advised caution, but there were no reports of missing persons or suspicious activity near the cabin. I realized that whoever had been there might have moved on, or perhaps they were someone who lived in the forest, someone used to hiding and hunting in the shadows. I didn't want to know. I drove home slowly, constantly checking the rearview mirror, feeling the tension slowly drain from my body. By the time I reached my apartment, I was exhausted. The relief of safety was overwhelming. I took a long shower, washed the grime and the fear from my body, and made a meal. I sat quietly, replaying every detail of the cabin, every noise, every shadow, and I felt a strange mix of fear and pride. I had survived an encounter that could have ended badly. I had trusted my instincts, remained vigilant, and acted decisively. I had faced the unknown alone and come out intact. In the weeks that followed, I returned to the cabin once more, during the day with other hikers. We found it empty, as if nothing had happened. The tracks were gone, the forest calm. I realized then that survival wasn't about luck. It was about preparation, awareness, and courage. I still think about that night, the sense of being hunted, and it reminds me that the wilderness is unpredictable and human danger can be close to home, even in the most isolated places. I never went back alone. I never stayed overnight. But the cabin remains in my mind, a place of fear and learning, a reminder that reality can be terrifying enough without any need for ghosts or fairy tales. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. I had rented a small cabin deep in the mountains, far from the noise of the city. The cabin was tucked into a narrow valley surrounded by dense pines and old oak trees. There was a small river that curved around the back of the property, and a dirt road led to the cabin from the main highway, a road that became narrower and rougher the closer I got to the valley. I wanted solitude, quiet, and the chance to be completely alone with my thoughts, and I thought I had found the perfect place. The drive up the mountain had been long, longer than I had expected. The GPS had trouble picking up the route, which meant I had to rely on a printed map I had bought at a small gas station on the way out. The air changed the higher I climbed. It became cooler and heavier with the scent of wet earth and pine needles. By the time I reached the final turn onto the dirt road, the sun was already dipping behind the mountain ridges, and the valley was cast in long, eerie shadows. The cabin itself was smaller than I had imagined, but that was part of its charm. It had a simple wooden frame, a stone chimney, and a wraparound porch that overlooked the river. The windows were dirty, streaked with dust and rain, but the interior looked livable. There was a small kitchen with a propane stove, a tiny fridge, a single bathroom, and a loft bedroom above the main living space. The furniture was sparse and rough, mostly wood, with a few mismatched chairs and a table. I set my bag down and looked around. Everything smelled faintly of damp wood and old smoke, which made it feel like it had been untouched for a long time. The first night was uneventful. I lit a small fire in the fireplace, cooked some pasta on the stove, and settled down in a chair near the fire with a book. The wind outside whispered through the trees, making the branches scrape against the cabin walls, but it didn't bother me. I had expected that. I fell asleep wrapped in a blanket, the sound of the river in the background soothing me. When I woke the next morning, the valley was bathed in a soft light, the sun rising behind the mountains and turning the river silver. I opened the windows to let in fresh air and walked around the perimeter of the cabin, taking in the dense forest, the moss-covered rocks, and the uneven terrain. Everything seemed untouched, quiet except for the sound of birds and the river. I felt a small thrill of excitement, being completely alone. The next few days passed slowly but comfortably. I hiked along the river, marked trails on my map, collected firewood, and cooked simple meals. There were moments of unease, but nothing concrete. Branches snapping too sharply, the distant sound of something moving through the trees, but I told myself it was just the wind or wildlife. I had expected isolation, and part of that experience was accepting the occasional small fear. On the fourth day, I decided to hike further into the forest, following a trail that led to a ridge overlooking the valley. The path became steeper and rockier, the trees more twisted and dense. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. Even the birds seemed to disappear, replaced by the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. I had packed a small backpack with water, snacks, and my camera, and I felt prepared. About 2 hours in, I realized I had strayed from the marked trail. The path I was on seemed less traveled, almost forgotten. The trees grew closer together, and the ground was uneven with roots and fallen branches. I noticed signs of wildlife, broken branches, tracks in the mud, but there was no sign of human presence. As I pushed forward, a sudden noise froze me in place. It was the sound of heavy footsteps, not quite like an animal, more deliberate, crunching through the underbrush in a way that made my stomach tighten. I paused, listening. The sound stopped, then started again, moving parallel to where I was. I tried to convince myself it was a deer or a bear, but the rhythm of the steps didn't match anything I had ever heard in the forest. It felt too heavy, too purposeful. I debated turning back, but my curiosity got the better of me. I continued slowly, moving off the trail to keep some cover. I had gone maybe another 100 feet when I saw it. A figure moving through the trees, just far enough away to be partially hidden, but unmistakable. It was a person, dressed in dark clothing, hunched over slightly, moving carefully but quickly. My heart began to race. The figure did not look like a hiker. There was something off in the way they moved, as if they were familiar with the forest in a way I was not. I decided to head back, keeping my eyes on the figure. As soon as I turned to leave, I realized I had no idea which direction led back to the trail. The terrain looked similar in every direction, dense and shadowed, and the sun was already beginning to sink. I felt a rising panic. I tried to retrace my steps, but every landmark seemed to vanish behind the thick trees. The footsteps returned, closer this time. I broke into a run, crashing through branches and underbrush, my lungs burning, my hands and arms scratched by the trees. Every few seconds, I looked over my shoulder. The figure was keeping pace, not chasing me openly, but following. My fear turned into something more primal. This was no accidental encounter. Whoever this was knew exactly where I was. I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing behind a large rock. I tried to catch my breath, my ears straining to hear the figure's movements. The footsteps stopped, but I could hear faint breathing. My mind raced through options. I had my phone, but there was no signal. I thought of the cabin, but getting back meant moving through the same area where the figure could easily intercept me. I stayed hidden until night fell. The darkness made it nearly impossible to move without alerting the person. I could hear the forest sounds, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of an owl, but nothing that indicated the figure had left. I thought about staying put until morning, but the cold seeped into my clothes, and I had no way to build a fire without giving away my position. Around midnight, I noticed faint lights through the trees, flashlights moving slowly. The figure was using them now, searching. My heart pounded as I realized I needed a plan. I had seen a narrow stream earlier, not far from where I had hidden. It was dark and shallow, but I thought I might be able to follow it downhill to the river near the cabin. The noise of the water could mask my movements. I waited until the figure was distracted, then moved quietly, keeping low, using the trees for cover. My feet slipped on wet leaves and mud, and I nearly fell several times, but I kept going. The sound of running water grew louder. I followed the stream carefully, stepping on rocks and avoiding branches that could snap. After what felt like hours, I finally emerged onto the riverbank near my cabin. I stayed hidden in the shadows until sunrise. When the light finally broke through the trees, I crept back to the cabin. Everything looked normal at first, but I noticed something immediately. The door to the cabin was slightly ajar. My stomach dropped. I had locked it before leaving. There were no footprints in the mud, but I could see small signs of movement. A disturbed log, a few broken twigs near the porch. Whoever had followed me had been here. I entered cautiously, checking every corner. Nothing seemed stolen or damaged, but the feeling of intrusion remained. I decided I couldn't stay another night. I packed quickly, taking only essentials, and left the cabin. The drive back to the main road was tense. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure emerge from the trees. When I finally reached a small town, I stopped at a gas station to call the police. They listened, took notes, and assured me they would check the area. They explained that these forests were remote, and sometimes people camped illegally or lived off-grid. I filed a report and gave as much detail as I could. It was unnerving to think someone had been following me so closely, observing me in the forest, and possibly waiting for the right moment. Over the next few weeks, I avoided hiking or cabins in remote areas. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, the thought of someone hidden in the trees, tracking movement. Eventually, I returned to the area with friends, cautiously, and checked the cabin again. This time, nothing had changed. The forest seemed peaceful, almost normal. It was a stark contrast to my first experience. I realized that while danger had been real, my own awareness, planning, and quick thinking had saved me. I learned how important it was to respect isolation and to understand that not all dangers in the forest were animals or accidents. Sometimes it was people. The incident stayed with me for a long time. I couldn't erase the memory of the footsteps following me, the figure in the shadows, or the cabin door left ajar. But over time, I processed it, understanding that fear can be managed with preparation, caution, and awareness. I returned to hiking, but I never went alone again, and I always made sure someone knew exactly where I was going. That trip taught me a lesson about survival, vigilance, and the unpredictability of the wild, and how quickly solitude can turn into a very real nightmare. I never liked being alone in the woods. Not that I had a choice that weekend. Work had been grueling for months, and I needed to get away from everything: emails, deadlines, the constant noise of people asking for things I could barely remember. I had found a small cabin for rent through a local listing. It was isolated, sitting at the edge of a dense forest about 3 hours from the nearest town. The photos online made it look cozy, warm, and peaceful. The owner promised running water, electricity, and a wood stove for heat. It seemed perfect. I wanted solitude, some quiet to reset, maybe a few days of hiking. I didn't realize how fragile that sense of security could be. The drive out there was longer than I expected. I followed the directions on my phone, taking winding roads that narrowed into single-lane dirt tracks. The trees grew taller, closer, blocking the sun in patches, casting long, dark shadows over the road. I noticed my phone signal was fading. A low warning bar blinked on and off. At first, I thought nothing of it. I was heading into the forest, after all. The cabin appeared suddenly, tucked between a line of pines, small and weathered. It wasn't as bright or inviting as the pictures had suggested, but it had character, the kind that comes with age and use. The porch sagged slightly on one side, and the wooden railing was loose, but the structure looked sound. The windows were dusty, and the paint had peeled in places. Still, I felt relief to have reached it. I parked my car on the uneven ground and unloaded my bags, noting that there was no one else in sight, not a soul around. The air was thick, the smell of pine and damp earth strong. Inside, the cabin was modest. A small living area with a wood stove, a kitchenette, a single bedroom, and a bathroom with a hot water heater. Everything was clean but plainly worn. There were stacks of firewood in the corner, canned goods on the shelves, and a heavy blanket folded neatly on the bed. I unpacked, placed my things on the bed, and walked around the cabin, inspecting it. I found the fuse box, checked the water tap, and even tested the stove. Everything worked, but I noticed some things that made me uneasy. The windows didn't lock properly, some of the floorboards creaked more than others, and there were deep scratches on the wooden floor near the front door, as if someone or something had dragged a heavy object across them. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just the age of the place. As the sun began to lower, I decided to gather firewood from the stack outside. The forest beyond the cabin was dense and darkened quickly, even in the late afternoon. I noticed movement among the trees, a quick rustle, almost like someone had stepped behind a bush, but when I looked, there was nothing. I told myself it was just an animal or the wind, but a sense of being watched settled over me. I gathered a decent pile of wood, more than I needed, and brought it inside. The first night was uneasy. I lit the stove, the flames casting flickering shadows on the walls. I could hear the wind through the trees, a constant whistling that seemed louder indoors. Something in the darkness of the room made me feel small, exposed, and foolish for coming alone. I slept lightly, waking at times to strange noises, branches scratching against the walls, a thump on the roof, the crunch of footsteps just outside. I told myself it was probably a raccoon, a deer, or even the house settling. I tried to calm down, but the unease remained. Morning brought sunlight and with it a sense of safety. I made coffee, looked out the window, and noticed tracks in the dirt outside. Footprints. They were heavy, boot-like, but larger than mine. They led from the edge of the forest toward the cabin, stopping just short of the porch, and then disappeared. I felt a knot in my stomach. I hadn't seen anyone around, and there was no road nearby that could have brought a visitor. I decided to hike, thinking movement might shake off the tension. The trail started easy enough. It wound along a creek, trees arching overhead. Birds chirped in the morning sun, and for a moment, I felt calm again. But the further I went, the quieter it became. The birds vanished. The creek seemed to disappear under layers of moss and fallen leaves, and the path became uneven, roots jutting out like old teeth. That's when I noticed the footprints again. They were irregular, sometimes skipping, sometimes pressing deeply like whoever or whatever had walked heavily at times, lightly at others. They were human, definitely adult, but I couldn't see anyone nearby. My heart started to beat faster. I debated turning back, but the thought of running into whoever had left those tracks if I rushed panicked me. I kept walking, keeping my eyes open. Every now and then, I caught a glimpse of movement between the trees, but when I turned my head fully, there was nothing. My stomach tightened with fear. I knew the forest was alive with wildlife, but the pattern of the tracks didn't match any animal I had ever seen. By late afternoon, I returned to the cabin. I felt watched. I checked the locks on the windows, barricaded the front door with a heavy chair, and moved the firewood to block the porch entrance. The sun dipped lower, and shadows began to stretch across the cabin. I stayed near the stove, the warmth of the fire a small comfort. I couldn't help checking outside repeatedly, seeing nothing yet feeling the presence of someone or something. Night came slowly. The wind picked up, carrying sounds from the forest. The crack of branches, the rustle of leaves, a distant animal call that seemed too deliberate to be ordinary. Around midnight, I heard the first distinct sound. A knock on the cabin door. Hard, single, deliberate. My stomach lurched. I froze, listening. Another knock, then a pause, then a faint scraping, like someone dragging a boot across the wood. I could barely breathe. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I was trapped inside, and outside was darker, deeper, and more dangerous. The knocking stopped, replaced by silence. The kind of silence that presses on your ears, makes you second-guess every sound. I stayed awake all night, too afraid to move. At dawn, I cautiously opened a window to peer outside. Nothing. No footprints. No sign of anyone nearby. It was as if the forest had swallowed them. The next day, I decided to leave. I didn't care about hiking or quiet anymore. I packed quickly, double-checked the cabin, and stepped outside. My car was there, fine, nothing touched. But then I saw it. Tire tracks in the dirt road I had driven on. Another set of prints ran parallel, this time closer to my car. I couldn't make sense of it. My heart pounded. I got in and started the car, intending to leave immediately. As I drove, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone following. But the forest remained still, quiet. Hours passed before I saw another car or any sign of civilization. The tension slowly eased, though I remained tense for the entire drive back. By the time I reached the highway, I realized how close I had come to something I couldn't fully understand. I went back to work, back to my routine, but the memory stayed with me. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of footsteps just outside the cabin at night, the deliberate knocking on the door, the tracks that appeared and vanished. I checked online later and found reports of isolated break-ins in that area, some by people who lived transiently in the forest, targeting cabins for supplies. That made sense, though it didn't comfort me. Whoever or whatever had been near me that weekend could have been watching for days, waiting for me to lower my guard. After that experience, I never went back to remote cabins. I couldn't forget the small details. The way the scratches on the floor seemed to start and stop at the door, how the footprints in the dirt were too large for me, how the forest could feel empty and alive at the same time. I kept my apartment in the city, noisy and crowded, but safe. I never felt that primal fear there. Months later, I learned from the cabin owner that another renter had reported similar experiences. Scratches near the door, strange footsteps, footprints that appeared out of nowhere. The owner assured me it was likely wildlife, a raccoon or bear, but I knew better. There was something human in those movements, something calculating, deliberate, something that had been waiting and watching, and perhaps would wait again for the next person who came alone. That realization was worse than any ghost story. It was real, it was dangerous, and it didn't vanish with the sunrise. I understood that fear wasn't just about what you could see. It was about what you couldn't, the possibilities lurking just beyond your vision, in the dark. I never returned to that area, and I warned anyone who would listen to be cautious. Some places in the world are not made for solitude. Some places are alive in ways you cannot control, and they remind you that safety is never guaranteed, even behind four walls. Even now, when I see a cabin advertised as secluded, I feel a shiver. I think of that forest, those footsteps, the sound of someone or something testing the door, the tracks that followed me, and the stark realization that being alone in the wild can leave you more exposed than you ever imagined. That weekend stayed with me, a lesson I could never unlearn. Isolation can be beautiful, but it can also be terrifying, and sometimes the danger is not obvious until it is too late. I drove down the narrow dirt road as the sun began to sink behind the dense line of pines. The orange light spilling through the trees in long streaks that bounced off the dust kicked up by the tires. The cabin I was heading to was deep in the mountains, far enough from any real town or neighbor that I could almost guarantee silence. I had been planning this trip for months, using it as a way to escape the city and all its noise. I wanted complete isolation, a chance to be alone with my thoughts, or at least what I thought were my thoughts. The GPS had stopped giving me directions a mile back, and now I was navigating purely by memory and the fading signs of the old wooden markers nailed to trees. My heart beat a little faster, not out of fear exactly, but from the thrill of being somewhere so remote. When I finally reached the clearing where the cabin sat, I killed the engine and sat for a moment just staring. The cabin was old, built of rough-hewn logs that were gray with age, with a stone chimney that looked like it hadn't seen smoke in years. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, and the windows were small and dark, some of the panes cracked. Surrounding it were towering pine trees that blocked out much of the fading light. I took a deep breath, opened the trunk, and started unloading my bags. Food, water, a first aid kit, a small camping stove, firewood, and blankets. The cabin had a wood stove inside, but I always brought a little extra, just in case. The first thing I did inside was inspect the place. The air smelled of old wood and mildew, and there was dust on every surface thick enough to leave streaks when touched. I opened the windows to let some air in, checking to make sure they could close again if the wind came. The floors creaked under my weight, and the walls seemed to hold the sound in a way that made every step louder than it should be. The cabin had one main room with a small kitchen area, a wood stove, and a single bedroom in the back. I placed my backpack in the corner of the bedroom, then went back to the main room to start a fire. The wood I brought burned easily, and soon the cabin was warm, the shadows from the flames flickering across the walls. Outside, the light was fading quickly. The forest around me was turning a deep, dark green, almost black. The sounds of birds and insects had quieted, replaced by the occasional creak of branches and a far-off rustle of movement that I assumed was deer or smaller animals. I ate a simple dinner of canned beans and bread, sitting on the edge of the small couch near the stove, and felt a sense of satisfaction in the simplicity of it. This was exactly why I had come here, away from screens, noise, and other people. Night came faster than I expected. The sky had turned a deep navy, and the wind through the pines was sharper now, rattling some of the older branches. I had a lantern and extra candles, so I lit them, the warm light casting moving shadows along the cabin walls. That was when I first noticed it. A quiet tapping sound, soft at first, but distinct. I froze, trying to convince myself it was just a branch brushing against the side of the cabin. I listened, and the tapping came again, steady, rhythmic, and coming from outside, against the wood. My stomach sank. The cabin was isolated. No neighbors, no hikers should be anywhere close at this hour. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. The cold hit me immediately. The wind had picked up, making the pine needles sting my cheeks. I circled the cabin slowly, flashlight sweeping the ground and trees. Nothing. The tapping had stopped, but my pulse was racing. I checked the locks on the doors again, noticing for the first time how flimsy the old latches were. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a raccoon or something larger, but even that didn't feel right. Back inside, I double-checked my gear. I placed the knife I carried in my pocket and kept the flashlight within reach. I tried to focus on the warmth of the fire, the familiarity of the cabin, but the sound lingered in my mind, and every creak of the cabin made my pulse jump. I decided to stay awake for a while, scanning the windows, listening. Hours passed. The tapping didn't return, and gradually, I felt myself drifting towards sleep. I remember sitting in a chair with my knees pulled to my chest, the lantern dim, my mind playing over every sound. That's when I heard it again, louder this time, against the side of the cabin near the kitchen. A heavy, deliberate thump, followed by scraping, like something was moving along the wall. My eyes shot to the window. I tried to see into the darkness, but the trees blocked much of the view, and I couldn't see anything clearly. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door just a crack. A shadow moved just beyond the edge of the clearing, fleeting, like a figure slipping behind a tree. Panic set in. I had to reason with myself, to tell myself it was impossible, that no one could have made it all the way out here without being noticed during the day. But the thought that someone or something might be outside, watching, waiting, made my hands shake. I moved to barricade the door with a heavy chair, something instinctive, almost animalistic. The flashlight stayed on, sweeping back and forth. Every rustle of the forest made me tense. Every branch snapping sounded like it was underfoot. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't even sit down again. I just stayed awake, moving from window to window, door to door, listening. Morning came slowly. The first light revealed nothing out of the ordinary. No footprints, no broken branches, no sign of movement. The tapping was gone, leaving only the wind and the distant calls of birds. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Still, I didn't lower my guard. I spent the day checking the perimeter of the cabin, collecting firewood, and keeping my mind busy with mundane tasks. I saw animal tracks. Deer, maybe a fox, but nothing human. That afternoon, I even walked a little further down the dirt road, looking for signs of anyone else, but there was nothing. The second night was different. I had convinced myself I was just exhausted, that my imagination had played tricks on me the first night. I set up the cabin the same way. Fire in the stove, lanterns lit, knife in pocket, flashlight ready. I tried to read a book to calm myself. The first few hours were quiet, peaceful even. Then I heard it. A low, deliberate crunch on the ground outside, like someone stepping over pine needles. I froze. I listened, barely breathing, as it moved closer. Not tapping this time, but deliberate steps, careful, cautious. Then a pause, right outside the window near the kitchen. I didn't move. I just waited, heart hammering, staring at the glass. A shadow passed over the curtain. I couldn't see clearly. I didn't want to. My mind raced through worst-case scenarios. I considered leaving immediately, but it was pitch black, and the dirt road was treacherous at night. I couldn't risk a fall or getting lost. So I stayed, moving only to keep the knife and flashlight within reach. The noise continued sporadically throughout the night. It would stop when I focused on it, then resume from a different side of the cabin. I realized that whoever or whatever was outside was moving around, testing, observing. I felt trapped in a circle of fear, unable to sleep, unable to leave, unable to do anything but wait. When dawn finally came, I was exhausted to the point of shaking. I made a plan immediately. I would pack and leave no matter what. That morning, I moved quickly. I packed everything, leaving nothing behind, not even the firewood. I double-checked the locks, then loaded my car in record time. Before I got in, I took one last look at the cabin. It was just a building, old and abandoned, but now it felt like a trap, a place where someone could hide just out of sight. I started the engine and drove off slowly, watching the tree line, scanning the edge of the clearing. Nothing. The drive down the mountain was tense. I kept the car on the dirt road, eyes scanning for any movement, any shadow that might be out of place. The town below eventually came into view, houses, people, the normal hum of life. It was almost surreal to go from that tense, isolated nightmare to the mundane world. I felt relief, but also a lingering unease, like I hadn't truly escaped the forest in my mind. I reported the incident to the local ranger station once I reached town, explaining the sounds, the shadows, and the fear I had felt. They took the report seriously, noting that the area had occasional trespassers and poachers, but there was no evidence found at the cabin itself. They advised me to stay in more populated areas if I returned to the mountains. Weeks later, I still think about that cabin. I replay the sounds, the shadows, and the feeling of being watched. But I also remember how careful preparation, calm thinking, and instinct kept me safe. I learned a lot about fear, about isolation, and about the real dangers of being far from help. I learned that sometimes the scariest moments aren't about ghosts or monsters, but about the unknown intentions of others and the vulnerability of being alone in the wilderness. I never returned to that cabin. I never wanted to, but I kept hiking, exploring, and camping, just in places where help was nearby and I could see the world clearly. That experience changed how I approached nature and solitude. I carry a stronger sense of awareness now, a respect for isolation, and an understanding that fear is as much a tool for survival as it is a challenge to endure. I made it out alive, and that clarity, the relief, the careful memory of every step I took to survive, was more valuable than anything else I gained from that trip. I had been planning the trip for months. I wanted to get away from the city, from the constant noise, the endless obligations, and the pressure that seemed to squeeze every ounce of energy out of me. My idea was simple: rent a small, remote cabin in the mountains, somewhere I could be alone, breathe, and take a break from everything. I found a listing online, an old cabin up in the dense part of the forest, miles from the nearest town. The pictures showed a wooden structure, rough but solid, with a small porch overlooking the valley. It was perfect for what I wanted: isolation, quiet, and space to just exist without interruption. I packed my car the night before, filling it with all the essentials: food that wouldn't spoil, water, warm clothes, blankets, a small first aid kit, a flashlight, and a few books. I also brought a small camping stove, extra fuel, and a set of tools just in case something went wrong. I had done enough trips in the past to know that being unprepared in the woods could quickly turn a simple getaway into a disaster. The drive started early in the morning. The sun was barely over the horizon as I left the city behind, the buildings and traffic gradually replaced by rolling hills, dense forests, and winding, barely maintained roads. The further I drove, the quieter it became. By the time I turned onto the gravel path that led to the cabin, I felt a strange mix of excitement and unease. I told myself it was just the isolation, the sudden lack of human activity. The cabin itself was exactly as the listing described. It was small, with a single room that combined a kitchen area, a sleeping space, and a tiny living area. There was a fireplace with a stack of wood next to it, a table with 2 chairs, and a small bathroom in the back. The air smelled of old pine and damp wood, and the silence was almost tangible. I unpacked my things, arranging them carefully, and decided to take a walk around the property before settling in. The surrounding forest was thick, with tall pines and oaks that blocked most of the sunlight. The ground was uneven, covered in roots, leaves, and rocks, and I had to watch my step as I moved. I noticed animal tracks, probably deer, scattered through the mud near the stream that ran behind the cabin. It felt wild and untouched, exactly what I had wanted. The first night passed uneventfully. I made a small fire in the fireplace, cooked some food on the camping stove, and read until my eyes felt heavy. Outside, the forest was alive with sounds: the rustling of leaves, the occasional snap of a branch, the distant call of a bird or some other animal. I fell asleep feeling oddly peaceful, cocooned by the walls of the cabin and the quiet that surrounded me. The next morning, I woke early, eager to explore more of the surrounding area. I had brought a map of local trails and planned to hike along a path that followed the ridge of the mountain. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and wet earth. I could see mist rising from the valley below, curling around the trees and disappearing into the morning sky. The hike was harder than I expected. The trail was steep in places, and the ground was slick from overnight rain. My legs burned as I climbed, but the view from the ridge was breathtaking. I could see for miles. Valleys, distant peaks, and the winding stream below that I had noticed from the cabin. That evening, when I returned, I noticed something odd. I had left the cabin door locked, but the lock looked disturbed, the metal slightly scratched as if someone had tried to force it. I dismissed it at first, thinking it was just the wind or some animal. I double-checked the door and windows, made sure everything was secure, and went to bed, a little uneasy but convincing myself it was nothing. The unease didn't go away. Over the next couple of days, I began noticing more signs. A footprint in the mud near the back of the cabin, too large to be mine. Twigs broken on the path that led to the front door. A feeling of being watched, especially when I was outside, moving through the trees. I told myself it was paranoia, that my mind was playing tricks, that isolation made every sound and shadow seem threatening. Still, I couldn't shake the tension. One afternoon, I was gathering firewood near the edge of the forest when I heard it. A branch snapping behind me. I froze, heart racing. The sound was deliberate, too loud to be a deer or small animal. I turned slowly, scanning the trees. At first, I saw nothing, just shadows and sunlight filtering through the leaves. Then I noticed a figure, or maybe a shape, standing just between two trees, barely visible but unmistakably human. My stomach dropped. I dropped the logs I was carrying, and the figure moved back, disappearing into the forest. I ran back to the cabin, slammed the door shut, and locked it. I checked the windows, the doors, even the chimney, making sure there were no other points of entry. The forest around me was silent again, as if nothing had happened, but I couldn't stop the feeling of being hunted. I spent the rest of the day inside, pacing, checking my phone for service, which was non-existent, and trying to convince myself to stay calm. I had planned this trip to escape stress, but now I felt trapped, isolated, and vulnerable. That night, I barely slept. Every sound made me jump. The wind rattling the trees, the creak of the cabin settling, the distant call of an animal. I kept the fireplace going, keeping the fire close to the door so I could see anyone approaching. I checked my supplies, food, water, tools, flashlight. Everything was still in order, but I knew I wasn't safe. Whoever or whatever had been near the cabin had the advantage of knowing the terrain, knowing how isolated I was. The next day, I decided to confront the situation logically. I couldn't stay locked inside forever, and I couldn't let fear paralyze me. I packed a small bag with essentials: knife, flashlight, some food and water, and made sure my phone was fully charged. I had a plan. I would hike back toward the main road, where I knew there would be other people, civilization, safety. I didn't know exactly how far it was, maybe several miles, but I had no choice. I left early in the morning, moving quickly but carefully along the narrow trail. The forest was dense, the air humid, and every step brought me closer to leaving but also deeper into danger. I kept my eyes and ears open, listening for signs of someone following me. I saw tracks in the mud, large and human, parallel to my own path. My heart sank. Whoever had been near the cabin was now following me. I tried to stay calm, reminding myself to think clearly. I veered off the main trail, taking a smaller, less obvious path. The forest grew thicker, the branches snagging my clothes, the underbrush scratching my arms and legs. I moved quietly, trying to put distance between myself and the person who might be following. Hours passed. My legs burned. My stomach ached from hunger, but I kept moving, knowing that stopping meant danger. By late afternoon, I emerged onto a dirt road that led toward the nearest town. Relief flooded me, but I stayed alert, scanning the trees behind me for any sign of pursuit. I walked as fast as I could, hoping to reach a place where I could flag down a car or find help. Hours passed, and eventually, I saw headlights in the distance. I ran toward them, waving my arms until the car stopped. I explained as quickly as I could that I had been hiking alone and someone had been following me. The driver offered to take me to the town nearby, where I could contact authorities. When I finally reached the town, the sense of safety was overwhelming. The police took my statement, inspected the area where the cabin was located, and confirmed what I had feared. There had been someone living or hiding in the woods nearby, using the isolation to watch and follow people who ventured close. They never found the person that day, but they reassured me that I was safe now, at least in civilization, and that they would patrol the area more regularly. I returned home the next day, exhausted, shaken, but alive. The experience left a mark on me, a reminder that nature, isolation, and human unpredictability can create fear far more tangible and real than any storybook ghost. I never went back to that cabin. The photos I had taken and the map of the area stayed locked away. A record of the trip I had once imagined as peaceful and restorative but had turned into a lesson in caution, vigilance, and survival. Over time, I realized that the real fear had not come from the forest or the cabin itself, but from the presence of another human being in a place where I was completely alone. The isolation magnified every sound, every movement, and turned my own mind into a source of anxiety. I learned to respect solitude and wilderness, but I also learned to never underestimate the danger that comes from other people, especially when there is no one else around to intervene. The trip that was supposed to refresh me left me tired, wary, and more aware of the fragility of safety. I became more careful about the places I visited alone, always informing someone of my plans, always carrying tools for defense, and always keeping a plan to escape. In the end, the cabin trip taught me that fear is not something imagined. It is a response to real risk, and the best way to survive it is through preparation, awareness, and action. The forest was still beautiful, the mountains still inviting, but I knew that beneath the calm exterior of nature, there could be very real dangers, and I would never take solitude for granted again. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. The city had been wearing me down with its noise, its endless traffic, and the constant hum of people going about their lives. The idea of escaping into the forest, to a small, remote cabin tucked away among the trees, was something I clung to like a lifeline. I had found the cabin online, advertised as rustic and off the grid. The pictures showed a small wooden structure, surrounded by thick forest, with a creek running nearby. The isolation was perfect. I packed my car with the essentials: a large duffel bag with clothes, a backpack with supplies, canned food, a small first aid kit, some tools, a flashlight, a lighter, and a few bottles of water. I had also brought a battery-powered lantern, an extra set of batteries, and a portable stove. I didn't want to take any chances in case something went wrong. The drive out of the city was long, and as the roads narrowed and became less maintained, I could feel the tension in my body easing. The air was cleaner, colder, and smelled faintly of pine and damp earth. The forest seemed to grow denser as I drove further, the trees taller and closer together, their trunks forming dark walls along the narrow, winding road. At some point, the asphalt ended, replaced by a gravel path that shook the car with every bump. I could feel that I was leaving civilization behind with every mile. Finally, I reached the cabin. It was smaller than it looked in the pictures, but sturdier. The wood was weathered and darkened from years of rain and sun, but the roof looked intact, and the small chimney promised warmth if I could get a fire going. The porch creaked under my weight as I stepped out, and I let my duffel bag slide off my shoulder and onto the floor. The forest around the cabin was dense, almost suffocatingly so. The trees rose tall and straight, their thick canopies filtering the weak winter sun into dull streaks that barely touched the ground. There was no road visible beyond the gravel path, no other signs of life. Just the wind rustling the branches and the occasional snap of a twig. I spent the first hour unpacking and exploring the cabin. Inside, it was simple. A small living area with a wooden table and 2 chairs, a tiny kitchen area with a sink and a countertop, and a loft that served as the sleeping area. There were shelves with some old books and a few kitchen utensils left behind by previous visitors. The cabin had electricity, but I had been warned it was unreliable, so I set up my lanterns and stocked them with fresh batteries. I unpacked my food and organized it carefully, storing some in airtight containers to keep animals away. I checked the stove and the fireplace. The chimney seemed clean enough to light a fire safely, which I did as soon as dusk began to fall. The small fire cast long, dancing shadows across the walls, making the cabin feel smaller and more enclosed, yet warm and safe. Night fell quickly. The forest outside became a wall of darkness. Every sound was amplified: the rustle of leaves, the distant call of an owl, the occasional crack of a branch somewhere deeper in the woods. I tried to remind myself that these were normal sounds, that I was alone but not in danger. I made a simple dinner on the stove, canned beans and rice, and ate while sitting close to the fire, my back pressed against the wall. I had brought a notebook and a pen and tried to write down my thoughts, to focus on something mundane, to keep my mind from drifting toward fear. It wasn't long before the unease began to creep in. At first, it was subtle, a feeling that I was being watched. The shadows outside the windows seemed too dark, too alive. The wind outside sounded almost like whispers, though I knew it was just the trees. I kept telling myself that I was imagining things. I checked the doors and windows again, making sure they were locked and secure. Everything was as it should be. The unease, however, didn't go away. The first real sign that something was wrong came late at night. I had gone to the loft to sleep. The fire in the fireplace had burned low, and I had closed the cabin's wooden shutters to keep the cold out. I was lying in the small loft, wrapped in a thick blanket, staring at the ceiling when I heard it. A faint scrape. At first, I thought it was the wind, the trees brushing against the cabin, but the sound was different. It was deliberate, a scraping sound against wood. Slow and irregular. I froze, listening. My heart started to pound, loud and insistent in the quiet cabin. The scrape came again, this time from the side of the cabin, near the door. I didn't move. I strained my ears. The sound stopped. I waited, holding my breath. Then it came again, followed by another. A soft thump, as if someone or something heavy was shifting on the porch. I told myself it was an animal. Maybe a raccoon, maybe a stray dog. But the sound felt wrong. Too deliberate. Too measured. It didn't feel random like an animal's movements would. I grabbed my flashlight from the bedside table and crept down the stairs, careful not to make a sound. I tried to listen for anything else, any movement, but the cabin was silent apart from the occasional pop of the dying fire. I shone the flashlight around the porch. Everything looked normal. No footprints, no shadows, nothing. I checked the locks again, made sure the door was secure. I even moved a chair in front of it just for peace of mind. The rest of the night passed slowly, but the feeling of being watched never left me. Every little noise, the creak of the floorboards, the whistle of wind through a crack in the wall, made me tense. Couldn't sleep. When the first light of morning came, I felt exhausted, as if I had run a marathon without moving an inch. During the day, I tried to keep myself busy. I explored the surrounding area, walked along the creek, took pictures of the trees and the frozen water. I tried to convince myself that the sounds I had heard were nothing. The forest was full of life, even in winter, and it made sense that animals were around. I chopped some firewood, cleaned the cabin, and prepared more food. I even laughed at myself for being paranoid. Yet, I couldn't shake the memory of the noises from the night before. Night came again. This time, I was more prepared. I set the fire higher, keeping the flames alive for longer, and I placed a small knife on the table beside me. I kept the flashlight within arm's reach and positioned myself so I could see both windows from my seat. I tried to read, but the words blurred as my eyes kept darting to the shadows outside. Then it happened again. The scrape, slow and deliberate, coming from the side of the cabin. I froze. The sound of someone stepping on the porch followed. My pulse raced. I couldn't see anything outside. The porch was empty, but the sound continued, moving around as if someone was pacing. My hands shook. I told myself not to panic. Maybe it was a large animal, a bear. But bears don't step softly. Bears don't pace deliberately on a porch. I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed the knife and edged toward the door, flashlight in hand. My heart was hammering. The porch was empty. No footprints in the snow. No signs of entry. Yet the sounds continued, like they were coming from every side at once. I felt trapped. The forest outside was dark and silent beyond the immediate area around the cabin, but the air felt thick with something I couldn't identify. Suddenly, there was a loud crash from the back of the cabin. Something heavy had struck the wall. I jumped back, my knife shaking in my hand. The fire in the fireplace crackled loudly, throwing shadows across the walls. I turned toward the loft, thinking about barricading myself there, but I knew it wouldn't help. There was no way to see outside from the loft without exposing myself to the door. I spent the rest of the night crouched on the floor by the fireplace, knife in hand, flashlight on, every muscle tense. The noises continued intermittently. Scrapes, thumps, soft steps. But I didn't dare investigate. When the first light of dawn came, I was exhausted beyond belief. My arms ached. My hands were raw from gripping the knife, and my mind was frayed. I needed to leave. During the day, I scouted the area more carefully. I noticed something I hadn't the day before. There were faint footprints in the snow around the cabin. Human footprints. Small, almost like a person trying to move quietly, circling the cabin, avoiding the forest. My stomach turned. I realized that whatever had been outside, it wasn't an animal. It was a person. Someone had been watching me, waiting for me to be alone. I felt a cold, creeping dread, knowing I was vulnerable in the cabin. I spent the rest of that day preparing to leave. I packed everything carefully, made sure the fire was out, and mapped out the safest route back to the main road. I decided to wait until the sun was fully up, when visibility would be best, before attempting to drive back. My car was parked far enough that it wasn't immediately visible from the cabin. When I finally left, I moved slowly, scanning the trees constantly. I didn't hear anything, and the footprints I had seen earlier were gone, but I didn't dare relax. The drive back was tense. Every shadow along the gravel road made me flinch. I didn't stop once until I reached the paved highway. Only then, with the noise and lights of civilization around me, did the tension start to ebb. Looking back, I realized how lucky I was. I never saw the person who had been outside. I never had a confrontation, but the fear of their presence, of someone watching and planning, was more terrifying than anything I could have imagined. The cabin, the forest, the isolation, all of it had been perfect until that moment. I had thought I was prepared for solitude, for nature, but I wasn't prepared for another human's intent. I reported the footprints and the cabin situation to the local authorities once I returned to town. They told me that the area sometimes attracts people who like to stalk or hide in remote cabins, especially during winter when few visitors come. I never returned to that cabin. Even now, the memory of being alone with that unseen watcher lingers, and I still think about the sounds in the dark, the soft scraping on wood, the deliberate steps outside my door. That experience taught me to respect isolation, not just for the beauty of the wilderness, but for the dangers that can hide in it. You can be cautious with animals, with the weather, with equipment, but you can't always see another human's intentions. And in that forest, in that small cabin, I had been completely exposed. I remember the first time I saw the cabin. It was tucked away in a dense forest, far from any road or sign of civilization. I had driven for hours on a narrow dirt track that wound through tall pines and oaks, each turn narrowing until I feared my car might scrape the trees on either side. When I finally arrived, the cabin seemed almost to materialize out of the wilderness. A simple wooden structure, weathered and gray, with a steep roof and a stone chimney that hadn't seen a fire in months, maybe years. The windows were dark, reflecting the thick canopy overhead, and a narrow path of trampled grass led to the front door. I had rented it online, a rustic retreat, it called itself, promising solitude and the quiet of untouched nature. That's what I wanted, quiet. I did not expect what came next. I unpacked the car slowly, careful not to make too much noise. Everything felt different here, the forest swallowing every sound I made, the air dense with the smell of wet earth and pine needles. The sun was low, slicing through the trees in long, orange streaks that illuminated the cabin in a way that made it seem almost alive. I remember feeling a sudden pang of anxiety, a small flicker in my chest, but I shrugged it off. It was just the isolation, the unfamiliarity. That was normal. I had come here to be alone, to read, to think, to get away from the noise of life. The cabin interior was simple. A small living area with a sagging couch, a wood-burning stove, and a kitchen with just the basics. A few pans, a small fridge, a sink that didn't drain quickly. The walls were bare wood, rough and dark, and the floorboards creaked under every step. I had imagined being here would be peaceful, but the first thing I noticed was the silence. Not peaceful silence, but the kind that feels too complete, like the world outside had disappeared entirely. No birdsong, no wind stirring the branches, just a heavy, almost tangible stillness. I made a fire in the stove, carefully stacking kindling and dry wood, and watched the flames flicker to life. The smell of burning pine filled the cabin, warm and comforting, and for a while, I felt my tension ease. Outside, the light was fading, and I realized night would come fast in these woods. I had brought a lantern and extra batteries, but relying on electricity was a bad idea here, I knew. The power in this region could fail at any time, and I didn't want to be caught in the dark. Night fell quickly. The first hours were uneventful, but as darkness thickened, every sound outside became exaggerated. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, the distant call of a bird, or maybe something else. I tried to focus on a book, but my mind kept drifting to the noises, and the cabin suddenly felt too small, too exposed. I reminded myself that animals were common here, deer or raccoons, maybe a fox. That's all it was. Around midnight, I heard it. A slow, deliberate step on the porch outside the cabin. One step, then another and another. I froze, listening, heart hammering. The steps didn't come in a hurry, and there was no voice, no knocking, just the sound of someone, or something, walking slowly across the wooden boards of the porch. I checked the locks on the doors. The main door was latched, the windows closed tight. Everything was secure. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of something outside lingering just beyond the faint light from my fire. I grabbed a kitchen knife, small but sturdy, and moved to the window. The glass was dark, reflecting my own tense face back at me. I held my breath and tried to see out, but the shadows were too deep, the trees too dense. Then the steps stopped. Total silence again, but I knew it had not left. I could feel it, a weight in the air, a presence pressing against the thin walls of the cabin. I stayed at the window for what felt like hours, until exhaustion pulled me back to the stove, and I forced myself to sleep. The next morning, the world seemed normal again. Sunlight streamed through the windows, birds called in the trees, and the forest was calm. I convinced myself that I had imagined it, that the fear of isolation had made me hear things that weren't there. I went outside, circling the cabin, looking for any sign of intruders. Nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing to suggest anyone had been there overnight. Relief washed over me, but it was uneasy, like a warning that I wasn't ready to understand. I spent the next day exploring the woods, sticking close to the small trail that led down a slope toward a stream. The forest was dense, green and alive, and I felt my anxiety begin to fade. The isolation I had sought seemed less threatening in daylight. I marked my path carefully, taking note of landmarks so I could return to the cabin without trouble. I gathered some firewood for the next night and brought it back, noticing that the air was cooler now and shadows stretched longer. That night, the sounds returned. Not immediately, but in the middle of the night, the same deliberate steps on the porch. But this time, I heard something else. A soft scratching against the wood, like claws or fingernails scraping lightly. I gripped the knife tighter. The cabin's locks were secure, and yet every instinct screamed that someone, or something, was outside. I didn't sleep again, sitting by the fire, listening, straining my ears against every rustle and creak. Morning came slowly, the sunlight piercing through the cabin window, but exhaustion left me trembling. On the third day, I noticed something odd. Supplies I had left on the counter seemed slightly out of place. A bag of chips I had opened the day before was now lying on its side. A bottle of water was moved an inch. I had not touched them. My stomach sank. Maybe an animal had gotten inside. But the door had been locked, the windows secure. There was only one way in. That realization chilled me more than the steps ever had. I spent the day fortifying the cabin. I stacked extra wood against the door, checked all the locks, even considered boarding the windows with planks I found in a small shed behind the cabin. I didn't see anyone, but the feeling of being watched persisted. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves felt amplified. I began to sleep with the knife in my hand, keeping the lantern close, the fire never fully dying. By the fourth night, the steps were joined by voices, or at least sounds that could have been voices, low and unintelligible, muffled by the walls. I didn't dare look outside. I stayed in the darkest corner of the cabin, pressing my back against the wall, my knife ready. Hours passed. Daylight finally came, and I dared to breathe again. The morning was grim, heavy with tension. I resolved to leave. I packed quickly, loading my car with everything I could carry. As I started the engine, I noticed footprints in the dirt near the cabin. Large, heavy prints that did not match any human I had seen, and they led directly from the woods to the porch. Panic surged through me. I drove away as fast as the dirt road would allow, eyes darting to every shadow, hands gripping the wheel tight. I did not stop until I reached the first paved road, and even then, my heart raced. Weeks later, I learned that the cabin had been abandoned for years, originally built by a man who had vanished without a trace. Local rumors hinted at squatters in the area, people who lived in the forest, avoiding contact. Some were violent, territorial. Others were simply desperate, doing what they could to survive. I realized then that what I had experienced was entirely plausible. I had not been haunted by ghosts, but by the remnants of human desperation, the reality of isolation in a place where anyone could be watching and waiting. I never returned to that cabin. The fear it instilled lingered for months, and I avoided forests and cabins, even ones in more populated areas. But I learned something about myself, too, the thin line between safety and danger, the fragility of solitude. I understood that isolation could be terrifying not because of the supernatural, but because of how real, tangible threats could appear when no one else is around. I began to carry a pocket knife with me everywhere, learned to notice signs of human activity in the wilderness, and became hyper-aware of my surroundings. Eventually, I moved closer to town, closer to people, to the noise and light of civilization. It took time to shake the memory of the steps outside that cabin, the feeling of being watched, the knowledge that someone could be near without my knowing. I started to appreciate ordinary things. Doors that lock, neighbors within shouting distance, the constant hum of life around me. I told myself I had survived, and I had. I had learned to read the forest, to trust instincts, and to respect the dangers that exist in isolation. The memory of that cabin remained, a vivid, unshakable reminder that realism can be far scarier than any fairy tale, and that survival depends not on luck, but on awareness, preparation, and the ability to act decisively when the unknown is pressing close. In the end, the cabin became a story I carried with me, a warning etched into my memory. I never sought solitude in that extreme again, but I also never forgot the lessons it taught me. The fear was real, yes, but so was my ability to endure it, to leave, and to return safely to the world where light and people exist. That knowledge, strange as it might sound, was both terrifying and reassuring. I had faced true isolation, true danger, and survived, and the cabin, still standing in the forest somewhere, waiting, remained as a silent monument to the very real power of being alone in a place where someone else might already be.